Hey, how are you doing? Long time no see. I missed you guys. But in any case, I thought we might jump into Rubenstein's AP Human Geography, Chapter 10, Key Issue 1. We're looking at where did agriculture originate? Agriculture, a lot of people say this chapter is boring, but I actually like it. I don't know, because we talk about the Green Revolution, we talk about food and how it affects us and where it all came from. It was kind of fun for me. So the invention of agriculture, it's kind of hard to guess where it came from because it happened before recorded history, and they're not really sure. But when we talk about agriculture, it is the deliberate modification of the Earth's surface through cultivation of plants and rearing animals for sustenance and economic gain. The origins, they don't know, really. The guess is that they came from like hunters and gatherers. But half the people in less developed countries are farmers, and they're feeding most of themselves. So you think about that. There's still a whole bunch of people that are having to live off whatever they grow. Compared to the United States, where you've got only 2% of the people here in the United States that are farmers. And for the most part, those people aren't even really supporting themselves with the food. They're still just growing like one cash crop to sell to the masses. Way back in the day, thousands, hundreds of thousands, whatever you believe, was the earth 10,000 billions years old? Or, do you believe it's just whatever? The book says, thousands of years ago, hunters and gatherers, they went around collecting things. They fished, gathered plants, lived in small groups. They couldn't have too many people though, because large numbers would exhaust the supply. They traveled frequently. They had homes that were mobile because they pick them up and move to the next location as they follow the seasonal movement of animals and plants. Nowadays, there's less than 0.005% of the world's population that are hunter-gatherers. Kind of hard to believe that there's actually some people that still are hunter-gatherers. There's a picture of some dude there right now. Today, examples of hunter-gatherers that still exist are Australia's Spinifex people, India's Sentinelese people, and Botswana and Namibia's Bush people. The agricultural revolution. Boy, that sounds exciting, doesn't it? Hey guys, I'm going to a party and it's called the agricultural revolution. Well, that sounds good. Well, what is it? It's where people learn how to grow plants. Yep, it's a time when human beings first domesticated plants and animals, and they no longer relied on hunting and gathering. So pretty much they stopped moving around, following their food, and they sat in their lawn chairs and watched the crops grow. And they're like, oh, this is easy, cool. We'll just sit here and have more people and work on things like art and education. How did this even happen? Like, how did people know to start planting things? Well, they don't really know because, again, it's before recorded history. The thought is perhaps people noticed plants that were dropped on the ground, and then days or weeks later, they're like, hey, this area where we dropped this food, it's growing new plants. Maybe we should try planting some other things and see what happens. Geographers believe that this was the reason for the sudden population increase. People stopped moving around, they planted and waited for more food to grow. They have more time, obviously, so they can sit around, they can reproduce a lot more, and the population is going to grow. About 10,000 years ago, the last ice age ended, which means the ice recedes, there's more land mass for planting foods, and you have better weather to grow the crops. And people just have a preference for living in a fixed place with a permanent settlement as opposed to following the seasonal growth of plants and animals moving around. The hearths of crops, where do they originate? Well, in Southwest Asia, the thinking is this is where barley, wheat, lentil, and olive occurred about 10,000 years ago. And from here, the wheat spread to the west, into Europe, and into Central Asia. The hearth for crops in East Asia was rice along the Yangtze River in China and millet along the Yellow River about 10,000 years ago. In sub-Saharan Africa, you see the origination of sorghums, yams, millet, and rice, again, about 10,000 years ago, and it probably moved south into the southern portions of Africa. And in Latin America, you got beans and cotton in Mexico, potato in Peru, and this happens about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and maize, which diffused north and south, north up into North America and south, not all the way to the tip of South America. Whenever we say maize, it's the same thing as corn. It's just that we say corn in the United States, so think of them simultaneously. Or simultaneously? I don't know. Think of it as the same thing. Or here you can see a graphic of the spread of everything. So we just were talking about things in the Latin American region. So you got cotton, lima beans, maize, potato, sweet potato, and they're diffusing north and south. Yam, sorghum, they're here in Africa, and they spread north and south. You've got wheat, barley, lentils, rye. This is like the breadbasket. Remember this right here is Mesopotamia. It's what we call the breadbasket, the initial breadbasket of the world. East Asia, you got rice, of course, and Southeast Asia, you got the mango and the coconut, things like that become very popular. And they spread, they diffuse across the world from those locations. Animal hearths. Look at these beautiful horses over here. Yeah, I'm in a good mood today. What? Can you take it? Yes, you can, because you need this course, because I'm the only one who does it for you, so you're welcome, and it's my joy to do this for you. Anyways, animal hearths. Southwest Asia. This is where they thought to have had the hearth for the domestication of the largest animals. Think of cattle, goat, pigs, and sheep. All these things that we commonly think of in agriculture, we're thinking it came from Southwest Asia about 8,000, 9,000 years ago. Dogs, man's best friend. I myself have 3 dogs right now. You're welcome. That's information that you can keep with you. Probably not going to be handy for the AP exam, but this will. Dogs, about maybe 12,000 years ago in Southwest Asia, East Asia, and Europe. That's where they came from, and now they're all the way across the earth there. The horse, you think about the Mongolians, Genghis Khan. One of the reasons why they conquered everything is because they had horsepower. They were able to shoot with their bows and arrows off horseback, but they were moved very quickly. Well, there you go. They originated in Central Asia, which may have been associated with the spread of the Indo-European language. Along with the mobile positioning and military strength of horses comes the Indo-European language. Because agriculture had multiple origin and shows people produce food in distinctive ways and in different regions coming from diversity of plants, climate conditions, and cultural preferences, we get an idea of why people eat the different things that they do. Agriculture is a big part of that. Looking at the origin of animals, Middle East, sheep, goat, pig, dog, big cattle regions, chicken, the horse up here in Central Asia, llama, alpaca, of course, is pretty much the only places where they are. Turkey. Why didn't turkey originate in Turkey? Isn't that interesting? Couldn't they have placed that together for some reason? But no, turkey originates here. Where do you hunt? I don't even think about hunting turkey down here anymore. I always think of it up here in the United States. Subsistence versus commercial agriculture. When we say subsistence agriculture, this is found in developing countries, and it's for the production of food for consumption by the family of the farmer. They don't have time. They don't have the money or resources to grow big crops. All they're doing with their small plot of land is growing food for themselves. Commercial agriculture, on the other hand, is found in developed countries, and it's production of food for sale. They're growing like one crop to sell to a ton of people. The differences are the percentage of farmers. In developed countries, we have very little farmers because they make food for a whole bunch of people using machines and all that. In developing countries, almost half of them are still farmers because they don't have the resources, money, time, small plots of land. They're growing it to feed themselves and their family. Consider in the USA, we only have 2% of our population that is farmers. Those 2% grow food for the entire country. Differences between subsistence and commercial is use of machinery. In commercial agriculture, there's less farmers, there's more machines, and transportation is easier to the market because we got things in the developed world like great transportation systems of trains, semi-trucks, vehicles. We got big combines to help us. Another difference is the farm size. In commercial agriculture, we've got these huge farm sizes that are controlled by very few people. Like one person has a combine, he's controlling vast lands and selling one crop. Whereas opposed to in subsistence agriculture, small plot of land, family members growing all the crops they can just to feed themselves. Here's a look at hectares of land per tractor. So in the United States, we've got, it's almost confusing to look at this because it's kind of the opposite. So you think about here in the United States, we've got a few tractors and a lot of land. That's meaning like one tractor is controlling a whole bunch of land because we're using commercial machines, commercial agriculture to grow one crop for tons of people. Same within Europe, as opposed to like Africa here, where you've got a whole lot of tractors and a whole lot of land. So that's not said right. Where we've got small pieces of land. What am I even saying? Let me make sure I'm saying this right. In Africa, you would have, I don't even know what I'm saying, people. Can you explain this to me, please? Because that'd be really helpful. Let's use this as a training opportunity. You tell yourself what this means, and you put it on the comment section of the video, and then I'll look at it, and I'll be like, oh yeah, that's what that meant. How about that? Where we're looking at why do people consume different foods? Well, we got our diets here. We're going to think about what's the most typical diet in the world. We're going to look at someone who's going to be an Asian farmer, and that person will grow just enough food to survive. Why is this person going to be the most typical? Because this is the most average common person that's found, the biggest population of a farmer who is just trying to sustain themselves. It still is someone in the developing world. People in the United States, we go to the grocery store and we don't even think about what goes on a farm for the most part. So think about how, not out of touch, but how different our reality is from the average human. We're a long way different. This contrasts the highlights in the difference in diets. In developed countries, we tend to eat a whole bunch more food because we have the time and we have the resources and money. The also affects what people eat. In developed countries, not so much because food is shipped a long way. But definitely in developing countries, the climate really affects what they eat because mostly the only things they eat is just what they grow. Cultural preferences also affect diet because the foods that might be preferred or foods that might be avoided are still very important within people's cultures. Think about our culture. We have preferences of food. Really we think about in this culture, it's a fast food diet, or maybe we go to a steakhouse. We don't eat things like horse in our society, I guess for the most part. I don't know anybody who eats horse. Do you guys eat horse? Put that in the message and see what kind of replies you get in the comment section down there below this video. Yeah. So like, for example, well, maybe on the coast in certain places like Japan, they really eat seafood. So, but maybe they avoid certain foods as well. Total consumption of food. We're looking at dietary energy consumption. This is the amount of food that an individual consumes. Hey, this is what you can talk about the next time you're at lunch with your friends. You can talk about, hey, what's your dietary energy consumption? It'll be a stimulating conversation. So what the book says is that people get the most energy from cereal grain like wheat, rice, and maize. I preface that by saying, there's so many of us that get our energy from protein. It's not as quick, but protein is longer lasting. So this is just one of those nuances about our book that is interesting to me. So the book says, Rubenstein says that we get most energy from cereal grains like wheat, rice, and maize. So wheat is mostly consumed in Europe and North America and Central and Southwest Asia. We think, why might that be? Well, because we've got the money to get the wheat. We've got the resources to get that stocked and brought to us consistently, as opposed to like you think about rice, where it's the most suitable crop in the East, South, and Southwest Asia. North America is like the breadbasket of the world right now. It wasn't always, but it definitely is right now. Rice, you think, well, why is it there? Because it's the crop that's suitable for these regions. Where is maize? Where do you find it predominantly? Well, this is the number one crop in the entire world. It's one of the reasons is because they give it to people, but a lot of it goes to animal feed, meaning they grow it because it's real cheap and consistent, and then give it to animals, and so it's quick energy for them as well. Other crops, we got cassava, sorghum, millet, plantains, sweet potatoes, yams. This is the main dietary energy in countries like sub-Saharan Africa. But this is the interesting one. You got Venezuela that's got a lot of sugar cane. So, of course, their main energy source is sugar. That's why those people have tons of energy, but only short bursts of energy, probably. Sources of nutrients. Protein is a nutrient needed for growth and maintenance of the human body. You think about protein in meats, in beans and stuff. Of course, you can get proteins in other things like grains. It's just not as much. The fundamental difference between developed and developing countries is their source of protein. Because anybody can eat piles of food and grains and all that, but protein is what is needed for growth. That's why it's very important. And when you have people that don't have protein, that's where you start to see people who are malnourished or they're not healthy. In developed countries, meat is 1/3 of all protein intake, including beef, pork, and poultry. We like the Western diet, the steak diet. In developing countries, meat is only 1/10 of the protein intake. So they rely on cereal grains. And think about it. You have to eat a lot of cereal grains to equal the protein in beef and pork and poultry. So even if you're growing tons of wheat and you're eating that, it's just not that much protein. So think about the diets for people over here in Africa. If they're eating mainly grains, they're not getting the protein they need. So we're looking at percentages of protein from meat, and obviously the continent of Africa is not getting protein from meat. That means they're not getting much protein, probably, because they're just eating grains. Of course, look at good old USA and Canada. We eat all of our steak and chicken over here, obviously. Brazil, you say, well, why is that? Why in Brazil and Argentina? They've got a great history of cattle in those two regions as well. Oh, yeah, China's up and coming, and they might be one of the largest producers of steak nowadays. I just wanted to point that out. Nutrition and hunger. Food security. This becomes very important. If we're feeling food secure, we're looking at the physical, social, economic access. Let me start over. We're looking at the physical, social, and economic access at all times to safe and nutritious food, sufficient to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Basically, can you get the food you want as much as you want to make you healthy and active? That's food security. A lot of people don't have a lot of that, all of that, or portions of it. For our dietary energy needs, according to the United Nations, the average individual needs 1,800 kilocalories per day. Okay? The average worldwide is 2,800 kilocalories. So it seems like most people are getting well beyond this. In developed countries, we're getting 36. That's right. USA, of course, we fatties, all right? We're getting 3,800 kilocalories. We got tons. We're overfed. Not me. I'm in shape, bro. In developing regions, we're getting 2,600 kilocalories. So we're still over the minimum, but we're getting a lot less in sub-Saharan Africa with 2,400 kilocalories. Now, keep in mind, this is like the minimum, okay? If you're in sub-Saharan Africa doing lots of work, working for your food, that's going to be a lot more of a challenge when you're getting 2,400 kilocalories. And you may become undernourished. This is when your dietary energy consumption is continuously below the minimum. It's estimated that 870 million people worldwide, mostly in developing countries, but specifically in India and China, there's a lot of undernourished people. So let's look at the graph here. As far as undernourished, we see India is number 1, China number 2. Lots of other sub-Saharan countries in Africa as well. Here's a graph at the kilocal per person per day. Over 3,000, of course, we're seeing all of North America, well-fed, probably too well-fed. Brazil as well. They've got a huge cattle industry in Brazil. Northern Africa, lots of calories, lots of food. Europe, Russia, doing great. Australia. India and China up and coming, as well as Southwest Asia. Still, we're having a difficult time over here in Africa, especially Sub-Saharan and Central Africa. Income spent on food. Who spends the most money on the most money on food? Now, keep in mind, this is the percent of income spent on food. Why are these so high? Well, it's because they have to spend, if they get any money in these African countries, a lot of it goes to buying their food. Because think about it, if you make $1 per day in Africa, you have a good amount of money. And how much is it going to cost of that to buy food? A lot. So a high percent of your money goes to buying food. So what are you going to have left over for like clothing? Or what are you going to have left over for education? Or to have a vehicle? Or to buy stuff to make your business grow? Not much. Okay, same with India. Whereas the United States, not so much less of our income goes to buying food because we make so much more money. So you tend to see the countries and areas that have more, they tend to keep getting more and more and more. That's why it's so hard for these up-and-coming countries to compete with the core countries like United States, Canada, and these other countries in Europe. Next, Human Geography, Chapter 10, Key Issue 3, where is agriculture distributed? So agriculture in developing regions, they practice pastoral nomadism. This is the herding of domesticated animals. This is where people depend mostly on animals rather than crops for their milk, skin, hair, and they mostly trade these products for grains and meat. Major animals are camels, goats, and sheep. Nomads do not wander randomly, but they have a strong sense of territoriality. Some practice transhumance, which is the seasonal migration between mountains and lowland pasture areas. Their future, obviously, is declining due to technology, irrigation, farm growth, mining, and petroleum operations. Basically, civilized society needs their lands, and they're running out of space. More agriculture in developing regions. Shifting cultivation, also called slash and burn agriculture. This is where farmers clear land for planting by slashing vegetation and burning the debris. And then they grow crops on this cleared field for only a few years until the soil nutrients are depleted, and then they leave it to fallow or to sit and regrow. Terminology is called swidden. This is where they have the area cleared by hand with simple tools. The swidden is after it's burned and sits there for a while. The cleared land supports crops briefly for 3 years or less, so it's not very much time. After they've grown crops on it, they leave the land for about 6 to 20 years to fallow and regrow. Crops that they do this with include rice, maize, which we call corn, manioc, millet, sorghum, yams, sugarcane, plantain, and vegetables. These shifting cultivation lands were traditionally owned by a village, and mostly, well, a lot of them today are controlled by private landowners. So even today, you've got corporations and landowners that have bought up a lot of the land. Shifting cultivation, it occupies 1/4 of the lands of the total world land area, but it's only practiced by 5% of the people. So think about that. Very small amount of people down here, just 5%. They occupy 1/4 of the world's land area doing the shifting cultivation. That's a whole bunch. The future of shifting cultivation, it's obviously being replaced as well by things such as logging, ranching, and cash crops, where they grow like only one crop in a huge area. Critics say it should be replaced by a more efficient means of agriculture. Defenders say it's the most environmentally sound approach. Continuing to look at agriculture in developing regions. You've got intensive subsistence with wet rice dominant. Farmers must intensely grow their crops to subsist on a piece of land. So just think about it. Why do they call it intense? Well, they have to use every piece of land available to them, and they do it in a very intense manner. Areas where you find this wet rice dominant are in high agricultural density regions where you have lots of farmers and not very much land. They got to use every space possible. They got to produce enough food for their family on a very small land area. So wet rice. This is rice planted on dry land and then moved to a flooded field. They prepare the field by plowing it out. Then they flood the field by letting rainwater flow in, channeling a river, or by irrigation. And then they transplant the rice seedlings that are grown on dry land. They move them to the flooded field to grow full. And then they harvest it by hand. What commonly happens in subsistence farming intensive with wet rice dominant is double cropping, where they commonly get 2 harvests or double the crops per year out of one field. Intensive subsistence with wet rice not dominant. So it's still pretty intense. This is where the climate prevents growing of rice in some regions, where the summer precipitation is too low and winters are too harsh. So they can't grow rice in this area, but it's still really intense methods they have to do to sustain themselves. They grow things like wheat, barley, millet, oats, corn, sorghum, soybeans, and some cash crops like cotton, flax, hemp, and tobacco. Again, the land is worked intensely by hand and small tools, and they commonly practice crop rotation, where they have different crops each year to avoid exhausting the soil. Your example, since the Communist Revolution of 1949 in China, very few individuals actually own land. We think about the western portions of China and how many farmers there are. Well, very few of them actually own the land, because in 1949, the government organized the land into communes, where they have small villages. This system failed because people didn't have really a motivation to work, because they were doing work for the entire country, and why would you do more work than you need to succeed if there's no benefit to succeed? So the system did fail, but the government continues to be the owner of the lands. So now individual farmers simply rent the land. Still, in developing regions, the final thing we have is plantation farming. And this has been a point of controversy in our class, because we think of plantation farming as a one-crop growth farm. So that would make us think that it would be in commercial agriculture, right? But Rubenstein has listed it as a subsistence type farming. So be clear on which definition you might need plantation farming to fall into for whatever test you're taking or for the general knowledge you need to apply to whatever aspect. But for our text, plantation farming is in subsistence agriculture. This is a large commercial farm in a developing country that specializes in one or two crops. Most are located in the tropics or subtropics, especially in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. They're mainly owned by Europeans and North Americans. So think about it. The core countries are having the periphery countries do all the work with these plantations here. And they grow crops for sale mostly in developed countries. Crops including cotton, sugarcane, coffee, rubber, tobacco, cocoa, jute, bananas, tea, coconuts, and palm oil. On these plantations, the workers are usually temporary due to sparse locations. Think about it in our history in the United States. The plantations were big in the South. They grew cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. The demand increased for these crops grown on plantations with the textile factories that were created in England, and they were stimulated by Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1973 because they could make cotton a lot more fast and efficiently. Slaves were brought here to the United States until the Civil War, and then after slaves were freed at the finalization of the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation, plantations began to die. And so you don't see them in this country anymore, but they're still in multiple countries across the globe. So you take a look at coffee production. We thought about coffee and tobacco grown in the United States, the pre-Civil War area. Now you see where it's grown on plantations, mostly in Latin America, but you do see it in other places like India. Agriculture in developed regions, now we're developed, where we've got agribusiness. We have the system of commercial farming found in developed countries with farm. It's not isolated, but integrated into large food production industry. Basically, you got a whole business that goes across all aspects of industry and business that supports the farming industry. USA is only 2% farmers, but 20% of the labor force works in food production related to agribusiness. So we only have 2% farmers, but 20% of our labor force has something to do with farming or agribusiness through processing, packaging of food, storing, distributing, retailing, manufacturing food, fertilizer production, and seed production. Agriculture in developed regions. We've got mixed crop and livestock. This is the next version. This is where you have the integration of crops and livestock. Most of the land still grows crops, but it gets 3/4 of its income through animal products like beef, milk, and eggs. The thing about growing the crops on this system is most of the crops are fed to the animals rather than to humans. The manure from the animals improves soil fertility. This system allows for a more even workload distribution, reducing seasonal variations in income, meaning when your crops have been harvested and you've sold them and the winter's here, you still can get income from your livestock. Most common form of commercial agriculture in the U.S. is mixed crop and livestock. It utilizes crop rotation, where we have a cycle of various crops in field left to allow for nutrient replenishing. You use various crops, you let your field replenish, and you keep mixing it out. Commercial gardening and fruit farming. This is a highly efficient, large-scale operation using machines and migrant farm workers. We're not talking, a lot of times we think about truck farming in the system. We're not talking about people like mom and pop operations parked on the side of the road. No, we're talking about huge commercial operations. They're commonly practiced in the southeastern U.S. along with their huge, long growing season and humid climate, especially their accessibility to large markets on the East Coast like New York, Philadelphia, Washington, and Boston. Truck farming actually comes from the Middle English word truck, meaning bartering or exchange of commodities. They grow fruits and vegetables like apples, asparagus, cherries, lettuce, mushrooms, and tomatoes. And then they're sold fresh to consumers, and some of them are canned. Dairy farming, another type of agriculture in developed regions. This is the most important commercial agricultural practice on farms near large urban areas, specifically in the U.S., in the northeastern U.S. and southeastern Canada, northwestern Europe, and also in South and East Asia. It's really important because we need to be near the cities. Our fresh milk can only be consumed quickly before it goes bad. So traditionally, you would see this on farms or in small villages because you couldn't ship your things out with just by horse or someone walking. But with the growth of urban areas, you had still this increased demand in the city areas for people wanting their dairy. So with transportation and the rising incomes, that allowed for dairy to be able to be shipped further and faster for more people. Dairying is the most important form of commercial agriculture in the first ring outside the cities because of the highly perishable product. We're going to look at the rings of produce around cities. But milk, of course, wants to be close because it perishes very quickly. This first ring outside the city became known as the milk shed. India is the largest producer. You don't think about that, but India is the largest producer, followed by the United States, China, and Pakistan. Dairy farmers usually sell to wholesalers who repackage the milk and they ship it out for sale to consumers in stores. Challenges to dairy farming. It's a very labor-intensive process as the cows must be milked twice a day, every single day, and you have to feed the cows even in the winter when you don't have crops grown, so it gets expensive. You look at milk production. In our developed country, it remains consistent pretty much, but how much has it gone up in developing countries over the last 50 years? You see the demand and the production of milk go way up. You think about India, how it's now the largest producer of dairy. Here's our areas. Look at this. India, number one as far as milk production. You think about, okay, well, it's gone up. The demand has gone up. The production's gone up significantly. India is one of the most populated countries in the world. China is the most populated. So you can see why in developed countries, milk production has gone way up. And we get to grain farming, agriculture in developed regions. Grain is grown primarily for humans, not like mixed crop and livestock. So we're looking at stuff that's mainly for human consumption. So grain, when we talk about grain, this is the seed from various grasses such as wheat, corn, oats, barley, rice, millet, and others. The most important grain grown is wheat because it's the world's leading export crop. It's used to make flour, and you can do so many things with that, including making bread. It's sold for a higher price than the rest of these. It's stored relatively easily without spoiling for years at a time. It can be transported long distances, and China, India, and the United States produce the most. Farms now utilize the combine, which combine meaning it combines three things into one. It reaps, threshes, and cleans all at once. So especially in the United States, the process for growing wheat and grains is very efficient. So relatively few farmers can feed millions of people. Specific areas for wheat. In North America, you have the winter wheat, which you might find in Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma, because they plant it in the fall, it grows through the winter, and then they harvest it. Spring wheat in the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, Montana, and in Canada up in southern Saskatchewan. And then Palouse, Washington State, where they grow wheat and lentils. Here's wheat production. Again, you think about, well, the United States, the breadbasket of the world, which it still is, but look at China, the leading producer of wheat. Think about their population and how many people need wheat over there. They have to be the leading producer. Mediterranean agriculture. We're still looking at developed agriculture. Mediterranean agriculture. This exists primarily on lands bordering the Mediterranean Sea, but you also find it in southern California, central Chile, South Africa, and southwestern Australia because they border a sea. They have hot, dry summers, but moisture from the ocean, moderate winter temperatures, and it's on hilly land. Most of these crops in the Mediterranean agriculture are grown for human consumption, and we consider horticulture, which is the growing of fruits, vegetables, and flowers. I mean, think about it. All those grow in areas where they have these perfect setup. The most important cash crops are olives and grapes. When you go to Italy, you got grapes and olives. That's the Mediterranean. But half the land is still devoted to growing cereals, especially wheat for pasta and bread. Again, common sense, right? Think about Italy and that entire area in the Mediterranean. They've got breads, they've got cereals, they've got pastas, they've got olives and grapes. That's not hard to remember. Livestock ranching. Think about Texas and the cattle drives. Commercial grazing. Livestock ranching is the commercial grazing of livestock over an extensive area, adapted to arid or semi-arid land in developed countries where land is too sparse and the soil is too poor for crops. So we don't really see, I mean, we do, obviously driving down the road we see crops a lot, but when we think about it, this area over here is known for livestock ranching. So cattle ranching in the United States, although it was very popular in culture, it only really dominated from 1867 to 1885. That's not long at all. It's like 20 years. This cattle ranching idea grew because northern cities like Chicago paid $30 or $40 per head of cattle, and they had a big demand up there in the cities, while Texas only paid about $4 per head of cattle. So basically, would you want to sell your cow for $4 in Texas, or would you want to drive it up to Kansas City to ship it off to Chicago and get like $40 for one cow? And that's where the cattle drive came into play. The problem is cattle ranching came into conflict with farmers because of range wars, where farmers who grew crops put up barbed wire so that cattle couldn't roam through it and eat it and stomp on it. That was cool, except that it blocked cattle ranchers. They couldn't get their cattle to the market because we kept running into farms and barbed wire, so they cut the barbed wire down, which is why in Texas today it's illegal to carry a pair of barbed wire cutters in your truck. Still even today, although I don't think anybody's been prosecuted for that for 100 years. 60% of ranching today takes place on government-owned lands. Now think about that. Why can't these lands be owned by people? Why is it government-owned? Is it so that they maintain an open range for cattle, making sure no one shuts it off? Or is the government reaching too far and owning too much? We'll leave that for another time. Other regions that you wouldn't necessarily think about but have a lot of cattle, livestock ranching would be China. They actually lead in livestock ranching. Australia, Spain, Portugal, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. And there we are, cattle production. Look at this. Meat production, China, way up there. United States, of course, with their cattle production, way up there. Middle East, you got sheep production. Seems natural because we do think a lot about sheep in the area. Cattle. Now, these are two that confuse people, like Argentina, Brazil, lots of cattle production. Don't count those out. At the very beginning of the chapter, Rubenstein placed this graph, which didn't really make sense there because we didn't really know what these things were. Now, at the end of the chapter, we're going to wrap up by looking at it. So people who practice shifting cultivation, you can see they're in lots of tropical type areas, all near the equator, tropical areas like sub-Saharan Africa and South America. When you want to get intensive with subsistence, wet rice dominant, of course, you think about Asia. Wet rice not dominant, you find it in portions up here in northern Asia because the climate is not conducive for growing the rice. Pastoral nomadism, you think about nomads all through this area right here, specifically like northern Africa, the Middle East, you think about people grazing their sheep and goats all around, makes sense, right? Mixed crop and livestock, you find that all throughout Europe on the central and southeastern portions and in the eastern portion of the United States. And you can dig in from there. Commercial gardening, you find it all on the East Coast. Mediterranean, obviously, is all around the Mediterranean Sea. As always, I'm your excited and amazing host, Andrew Patterson. We're going to look at why our energy resource is important for development. Energy demand and supply. So supply, this is the quantity of something producers have available for sale. And demand is, of course, the quantity consumers are willing to buy. If you've got a huge supply of eggs, but you don't have the consumers wanting to buy it, then you've got a problem because you can't sell the money you put into all of your chickens and facilities for all your eggs. So we've got to have a good demand along with the supply. So as far as energy, we're looking at the demand and supply of fossil fuels. Now we should know that fossil fuels are the energy source formed from residue of plants and animals buried millions of years ago. Specifically, we're looking at coal, petroleum, and natural gas. The heaviest consumers of fossil fuels are developed countries, but most resources are found in developing countries. So we've got a problem there, right? So if we've got these huge cities and technologies and people in developed countries, and we need to go to developing countries to get all this stuff, what do you think is going to happen? That's right. Developed countries are going to take advantage of developing countries. So we look at the percentage of what's being used globally here, I believe, and we've got mostly petroleum that's going to be used up here. So the oils and gases. Second to that is coal and then natural gas. So we're getting huge amounts of all of our energy from these products. The demand for energy. Half the world's energy is consumed in developed countries. Of course, that leaves the other half to be consumed in developing countries. Of the two huge ones here that are devouring energy is the United States and China. They consume the most. Developed countries have far less people, but they use way more energy per capita, and it's so much higher per capita is per person. So you think about that. We like to maybe, in a way, look down on sub-Saharan Africa for not being as developed, but we're the ones using all of this energy. I mean, we consume so much more energy because think about it. If you've got one person in the USA, they're using air conditioning, they're using television, internet, lighting, power, all of this stuff, all this energy being used for their huge houses. Whereas sub-Saharan African people, maybe they're using none or very little. So think about all the businesses, all the homes, everything in transportation that's using energy. Energy supply. Why do some regions have abundant supply? Let's look at coal. The main reserves are in mid-latitude countries like China and the United States. Think about, Pennsylvania and all these areas that have great coal reserves in the United States, but also China. They're doing really well because they have access to coal. Petroleum, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Southwest Asia, and the United States. You think, well, why is the United States so successful? Well, we've got a lot of coal, we've got a lot of petroleum, we've got natural gas, and as far as development and energy that we need to run our economy and businesses, we've got the resources. Same with Russia, same with China. That's why these big three are so huge right now. And again, natural gas, Russia, Southwest Asia, and the United States. So There's two forms of energy. We've got renewable energy, which is essentially unlimited. Think of hydroelectric or water, geothermal, things that are from within the earth, fusion, wind, biomass, and solar. These things can theoretically go on forever without being used up. And then you've also got non-renewable energy. These forms of energy are so slowly created that it's, for practical purposes, it can't be renewed. I'm sorry, guys. Chapter 9, I just have not done the greatest job at spelling what needs to be spelled right, and I apologize for that. These videos are for you, and I have let you down. I am so sorry. I don't know what it is about chapter 9. It's just like I'm tongue-tied and I can't spell right. I do enjoy it, though. I like chapter 9. In any case, non-renewable energy, it can't be renewed. Think of fossil fuels. So if we use up all the oil, there ain't no more. And that could be a problem if our whole economy is dependent on oil. Energy reserves. Well, just like I said, the world faces potential issues with population growth, rapid development, and limited reserves. We have to ascertain what are our proven reserves and what are potential reserves. So as far as proven reserves, this is the supply of energy remaining in deposits that have been discovered. With coal, looks like we've got about 131 years left. That's it. As far as we know, only 131 years left, which seems like a decently enough long time. I think you and I are going to be able to live with coal, but think about our children. There's going to be apparently no coal left for them from what we know. Natural gas, we got 49 years left at current demand. That's not good. Okay, that means we're going to run out. Petroleum, 43 years left at current demand. How much gas do we use? How many cars do we have on our American streets? Think about the entire earth. How many cars are running? 43 years left. Let's see. At the making of this video, I'm 41. I darn sure want to be alive when I'm 84. So I'm hoping I'm not running out of petroleum. Actually, more than that, I'm hoping that we're running on renewable resources, such as electric or solar or something like that. But this is, at least by Rubinstein's textbook, where we are. So we look for potential reserves. These are undiscovered supply deposits. Where can we look for stuff? If we're about to run out of gas and petroleum, where can we look? Well, there's still undiscovered fields that hold natural gas and petroleum, but we just don't know where they are yet in the earth. We can also enhance the recovery of already discovered fields. There's new techniques and strategies for getting more use out of petroleum fields that have been thought to be inaccessible or already dried or used up. Whether you like it or not, they've got a new system called fracking that they've been using for a while, but it's pretty controversial because they're sending what they say is safe for the earth back down into the earth to force out natural gas. But if you start reading into all the material that's in fracking, it seems to be pretty toxic. So again, we're looking at potential reserves and options there. And unconventional sources. Where else can we find more coal and natural gas and petroleum? Well, let's look where we haven't looked before. So we look at our petroleum reserves here. Of course, we want to look at the United States first. Well, here's our petroleum reserves. We don't have that much. Canada's got tons. Saudi Arabia has a whole bunch. And that's why, we always consider oil and why we're going into the Middle East and dealing with the Saudis. It's because they've got a whole bunch of petroleum and we're going to need it. As we load here. This is another opportunity to tell you a story. Okay, when I was a young lad, I wanted to be, darn it. Well, for another time. Controlling petroleum reserves. If we've got a whole bunch of oil, how are we able to ration it or control it so where, we have some for ourselves and not everybody just takes it and uses it all up? Well, OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, they decided to band together, and make this pact here to control the petroleum reserves. This enabled oil-rich countries to have more control, meaning they weren't just selling it to multiple countries and doing whatever countries like the United States and England were asking. They kind of got together and said, let's control the cost and how we are selling and who we're giving our petroleum to. So you had developed countries that were extracting for cheap, and they sold it for cheap back in the United States and the United Kingdom. So these oil countries like Saudi Arabia, they didn't get much profit. So they came together and said, let's control it. Members include Algeria, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Angola, Ecuador, Iran, Nigeria, and Venezuela. So while the U.S. production remains constant, demand is increasing and it's met by its imports. So the U.S. imports a whole bunch of its oil. And we have to deal with OPEC. This is why when you hear about this in the news, it can be concerning because we want to make sure that these countries here are still getting us oil at a rate that's feasible for our consumers, people in this country to handle. Because if all of these members in OPEC got together and said, you know what, we're going to charge a whole bunch more for oil, it would be a problem. It would slow down transportation. It would increase the cost of lots of goods and services because it's all delivered by truck these days or ships coming across the ocean. And if it costs a whole bunch of money to ship it, then we're going to buy less and less. It's going to be more and more expensive. So think about it here. As far as production, this is our production in the United States. Just think of it as the amount of oil that we're needing, the oil that we're using. Well, our consumption is going up. We are using more and more and more oil. Here's how much oil we're making or getting ourselves. So there's a gap here. We have to fill it with something. So we've been filling it with imports. So more and more, we definitely have to continue dealing with OPEC because we continue to import. Now, we do have oil reserves in the United States, but we don't necessarily tap them. We're depending on imports right now. This is a look at the U.S. petroleum sources in barrels per day. So in 1973, we were getting a lot of our own oil, 69% in fact, and getting some from Canada and some from Venezuela. These are our big areas. Fast forward to 2012 at the printing of this book, and you can see that we've dropped by a significant amount here. We're not getting as much oil from our own country. We're still getting a whole lot from Canada, in fact, even more. And we're dealing with Saudi Arabia in a much bigger piece of the pie. We're dealing with OPEC countries here. And, this doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have oil because we do have reserve. It's just that we are depending on the imports right now to get our oil. Let's look at the oil price history. So back in 1970, we had oil companies in developed countries controlling the supply of oil in Southwest Asia, and they're keeping prices low. No problem for us as consumers in the United States. We're driving cars and we're getting gas for really, really cheap. Then, in about 1973, we've got the OPEC countries refusing to sell oil to countries, including the United States, because it was in war with its neighbor Israel. Okay, let me state that again. OPEC countries were OPEC countries were against Israel. Think about it. If you got Muslim countries, they are against Israel because Israel tends to be Jewish and Christian, backed by the United States and the United Kingdom. So Muslims aren't too happy with that. So these OPEC countries are Muslim for the most part, and this is when the price of gas went up because they made it go way, way up in 1973. Just think about the 1973 war with Israel. Fast forward, OPEC lifts its boycott, but it raises prices, right? So the price of oil goes up. In just before 1980, we had a revolution in Iran, and you got the Iran-Iraq war. It triggers oil shortages and higher prices, so it's jacked way, way up. So I remember in the 80s when we wanted to go on a summer vacation when I was a young kid, and we couldn't because the price of oil went way up. As a matter of fact, I was supposed to go to Disney World, and this situation right here ruined it for me because my dad was a minister and we had a limited amount of income, so we could not afford the gas. No joke. Okay. Fast forward, we're coming close to the 90s. We got the end of the Iran-Iraq war, and it brings increased supplies and lower prices. So gas is coming way back down in the early 90s here. It was great as I started to go into college because I could afford to go all the way up to Kansas my freshman year. Gas prices were low, and it was no problem. But as we fast forward and get into 2005 and beyond, we see prices rise as demand for oil in developing countries increases. That's right. We've got more and more people, more and more industry and development. We've got gas continuing to go up and up and up. These prices are going to increase because guess what? We need more. And OPEC countries know this. They know that we need it. We know that our demand is high, and so they're going to limit the supply and they're going to charge more. I don't know why my computer's not loading so fast these days. I'm thinking it's dealing with the internet, and I apologize. So we look at alternate energy sources. Nuclear. This is another option. Instead of using petroleum or natural gas, let's use nuclear. It's not renewable, but a large amount of energy is released from a small amount of material. Consider that 1 kilogram of enriched nuclear fuel contains more than 2 million times the energy that 1 kilogram of coal does. That's huge. So you have this tiny little bit, and it's going to release tons of energy. Well, there's some issues with it because you have potential accidents. When you create fission, you have radioactive waste. Here's 3 examples. And actually, 3 Mile Island was not in our textbook. Rubenstein didn't have to put that in there, but in Pennsylvania in 1979, they had an issue where they had to evacuate a lot of people. They didn't tell people, but they finally ended up, evacuating people, and they had a near meltdown in the United States of America with our power plants. Chernobyl in Russia, which is now in the Ukraine, 1986, you had a huge meltdown. The area is still not even occupied. And then Fukushima power plant in Japan in 2011, big deal, where you had radiation all over the place because the power plant was destroyed. Well, it was messed up after the earthquakes. So we've got issues potentially with nuclear power plants. Other issues are that uranium, which is needed to create the nuclear power, it's limited. These reserves come at a high cost, and it's very expensive to maintain these power plants. So we want to use nuclear. Okay, well, there's a limited amount of uranium. So where is the most uranium? It's got Australia. Australia is a huge place for it. Some in Canada, some in the United States. Kazakhstan, another big area where uranium reserves are found. And we're loading. Are we having a good day? I hope you are. I'm having a good day because I'm getting to talk about AP Human Geography. Let's look at power plants. So what we're seeing, first of all, the colors is the percent electricity that's created from nuclear power. So, for example, where we are in Texas, we're using about 1 to 20%, not very much as far as nuclear power. As opposed to some of these states on the eastern seaboard here, where we're getting like 40% and above. Like consider that maybe there's 50% nuclear power being created in Virginia here. Same with Illinois. Look at all these power plants. So in Texas, where we live, Dallas-Fort Worth is about right here. And we've got these nuclear power plants right here. I'm trying to think of the names of them. I know I just can't think of it right now. But these are, I don't know if you even realize that, Dallas-Fort Worth, but we've got nuclear power plants right next to us operating. Think about Chicago and Illinois. How many power plants, nuclear, are going on here? So many. Could be lots of potential problems. If you're over here and you're in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, look at all these power plants right around you. They're running by nuclear. Now, maybe it's no problem at all, but it's something that I like to think about because it potentially could be a big hazard. Renewable energy. We've got hydroelectric power, generating electricity from the movement of water. This is an option for us. Biomass. Biomass is derived from plant material and animal waste. It includes wood and crops, but it tends to be really inefficient, and it can reduce the forest because if you're using wood to fuel your power plants, you're going to be cutting down a lot of forest. Although I've watched a lot and done a lot of research on biomass, and actually it could be a really viable option because a lot of the crops, when we extract what we need as far as food for people or animals, naturally what's left is a lot of this product that we wouldn't do anything else with, which would be great for biomass. So that could be a great option. Wind. Potentially, there's tons of it, and it's free. The problem is that those big windmills, they modify the environment. They can be noisy. They can be lethal for birds, and you need a lot of them. Listen, I think it's cool to use engineering across the landscape to create clean energy. But let's be honest, when you have a whole bunch of windmills sitting out, it does modify the landscape. Like you're no longer looking out at this pristine, like desert landscape or windy mountaintop. Now a lot of times you're seeing these big old windmills. And if you look at those windmills, the blades, just one of those blades. If you've ever seen a truck carrying a blade driving down the highway, you got to consider that those things are huge. They're bigger than even a semi truck. So when you see those windmills, they're always pretty far away. But think about it, bigger than a semi truck is spinning around in the air. So if you got a flock of birds going past, it could be a problem. I mean, you would think the birds would be smart enough to not go right next to those things, but it does end up happening. Geothermal. This is hot water or steam from the earth. It can be used to create or harness the heat, and certainly can be used for energy. Nuclear fusion. This is not yet practical because of extremely high temperatures from smashing hydrogen atoms. This has been talked about a lot. No one can do it yet. Solar energy. It seems to be the biggest potential with endless, free, clean energy. And I have to admit, I've got solar panels all across my house running everything. It doesn't give me 100% because at the time when I put them in, Texas wasn't allowing solar to be used on 100% of your energy usage there because Texas is a oil, petroleum state, and they still want to get a lot of their money coming from that to support their industry. But solar energy seems to be like a great idea. There's 2 things. You have a passive solar energy system where it captures energy without using special devices. And it's just kind of like natural, where you might have big windows or you might have dark surfaces that are there painted black to absorb heat from the sunlight. Or you might have an active solar energy system where you've got collecting energy from the sun and it's transferred or converted to heat or electricity directly or indirectly. The biggest thing you think of is like this picture right here, the photovoltaic cell, where it converts light into electricity. And that's what we all have on houses. People, those of us with solar energy, like from places like Solar 10. Let's look at key issue 4, where we're taking a look at why do farmers face economic difficulties? Challenges in the developing countries. Subsistence farming and population growth. The challenge is to grow enough food for this rapidly growing population. Plus now, the people in cities can't grow food. Think about it. Lots of people living in buildings can't grow food, so you have to grow food for all of them too. These new farming methods, plows replacing hand tools, using more manure, terracing and irrigation, these are ways to combat that. They allow their land to fallow for shorter periods of time, which isn't necessarily good, but areas they might have are forest fallow, where they let it sit for 20 years, bush fallow, where they let it grow back up to like bush size and they let it fallow for 10 years, short fallow, only 2 years. These are all techniques that they're using to help feed more people. And then annual cropping, where fields are used every year, but they rotate between legumes and roots. So these are different nutrients pulled and put back into the ground. Or they might use multi-cropping, where fields are used several times per year, and they're not allowed to fallow at all. So they're really running the ground out of its nutrients. Subsistence farming and international trade. Here's the deal. Subsistence farmers have to grow food for their own families and the community, but now to compete, they also have to grow and sell internationally, which is a real big challenge because farmers can't afford new tools and they certainly can't afford fertilizers. So the land is split between food for families and crops for export. More challenges in developing countries. Drug crops. Let's face it. If you can make a lot more money by growing drugs and you're trying to take care of your family, it's only natural that people are going to do whatever they can to support themselves. So a lot of crops are being grown as converted to drugs. So for example, cocaine is derived from the coca leaf, and you find these mostly in Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. Now the interesting thing is I've been to all three of these countries. In Colombia, growing coca leaf is illegal. They even spray to kill the crops, even when they find like the hidden farms that are growing the coca leaf, because a lot of it's processed and sent to the United States as cocaine. But in Peru, growing of the coca leaf is completely legal. As a matter of fact, they drink coca tea over there. A lot of times when we were hiking over the Andes Mountains, we drank coca tea. Not illegal there. Colombia, totally illegal. Interesting. Heroin, which is derived from the raw opium gum, is produced by the poppy plant. You find this mostly in Afghanistan, like 90%. Most of it's in Afghanistan, but also in Myanmar and Laos. And then marijuana is produced pretty much everywhere from the cannabis sativa plant. And a lot of it's found in Mexico and sold to the richer developed country of the United States, just north. Food prices. Price has been the biggest issue in the 21st century rather than supply. Think about that. We've got enough. It just costs too much. The prices doubled from 2006 to 2000. I cannot talk at all. I'm trying to get this done for people. And I'm sorry. I'll dig back in. I'm insane. What can I say? Food prices, well, they doubled from 2006 to 2008 because we had poor weather in the South Pacific and North America. There was a higher demand, especially in China and India, because of increasing population. And there were smaller breakthroughs, meaning we didn't come up with more and more efficient ways to grow the food, so it slowly began to get more expensive. And we began to use crops for biofuels instead of food, meaning if we grew corn, we weren't necessarily growing it to feed people or cows. We were growing it as to be used in cars, which isn't necessarily true, but that's what Rubenstein puts in there. So we look at where heroin comes from, cocaine, all drugs. Here's our coca plant, of course, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, most of it going to the United States, some of it going to Europe. We look at opium from Afghanistan region, a lot of it going to Europe. You don't think about too many people having heroin. Well, that's not true, but there's obviously a heroin problem in the United States as well, but so much of it goes directly to Europe. Africa's food supply shortage. So sub-Saharan Africa, meaning below the Saharan desert, it struggles to keep food production ahead of population growth. Here's why. Famine wipes out a lot of the crops, so they're not able to grow enough crops. Animals have overgrazed areas. Like there's so much land that's being overused or misused that even when you have animals, they're like eating all the grass. So guess what? They can't grow crops there either because the nutrients in the grass are gone. It's hard to find water in Africa because it's not irrigated very well. And if you got a famine as well, you got problems finding water. And the government, they attempt to keep food costs low for urban residents. So they force down the price, but then farmers who are growing it and sweating, trying to get every ounce of crop out, they can't sell it to make a profit because the government keeps the prices low. So if you can't make a profit, why would you grow more than you need for your own family? And we look at this graph here. We see that food production and population have both kind of gone up at the same pace. Food per capita, meaning food per person, has kind of remained even though. Challenges for farmers in developed countries. We looked at developing, now let's look at developed countries. What's their problems? Well, there's a lot of overproduction in commercial farming. Farmers suffer because they can make too much food. And they make so much that they have an oversupply, and people don't need that much. This occurs because commercial farming is extremely efficient with new technologies, fertilizers, pesticides, and management practices. The demand is stagnant. It's stagnant because in most developed countries, there's low population growth and markets are already saturated. Meaning, people have already got tons of corn in the United States. So there's not going to be like a huge demand because our population isn't really growing, except from immigration. So that's why the United States continues to sustain itself, really. Lots of European countries, population isn't growing, there's not tons of immigration, so farmers have a hard time making a profit each year. To address this in the United States, they encourage farmers not to grow crops in excess, meaning if you think you can make a whole bunch of money by growing tons of corn, don't, because everybody's going to be growing corn, so just grow enough. The U.S. government also pays farmers when prices are low, because we got to still have farmers, so when prices are low, the United States government will give money back to the farmers. The U.S. government also buys surplus production and sells or donates it to foreign governments. So if you're growing soybeans and there's too many soybeans to sell, like maybe everybody had a bunch of soybeans this year, as my voice cracks. If everybody had a bunch of soybeans, there's not going to be a high demand, meaning the price is going to be really, really low. So the U.S. government will buy it to give money back to the farmers so they can be sustainable, and then they donate or sell it to other foreign governments. Look at the dairy productivity here in the United States. So here's the yield. 1970, 98, pretty cool, and then the yield went way up because they started to enhance it. They got more efficient with machines, but they enhanced milk production with growth hormones. That's why you got to really consider what you're drinking. But the production went way up. So we have tons of milk. And then as far as the herds went way down, so you can have less cows producing more and more milk. So think about that. I don't know if that's a good thing because you're drinking milk that's highly modified. But that's just me as a person, not as a teacher, okay? So don't get crazy on me. Challenges for farmers in developed countries. Well, they need to have access to markets. The distance to the market influences the crop that you plant. Meaning, if you're a dairy farmer, you want to be pretty close to the market because your dairy is going to spoil on a long trip across the country. That wouldn't be good. So in the first ring here, we're looking at von Thunen's model. He came up with rings. You can think of it as like the middle of the city here, and as you go out from the city farther and farther away, you have different products. It also could be across the country. Like this could be like, the middle of the country and all the way across the country as well. Anyways, this model was created by Johann Heinrich von Thunen from Germany in 1826, and you can use it in cities. But also applied to the national or global scale. So in the first ring, we're looking at things that perish, like market-oriented gardens and milk producers. It's also pretty expensive to deliver. In the second ring, This is where you've got forestry, wood for timber and fuel. It's close because it's really bulky and it's heavy to transport. In the third ring, you have got various crops and pasture. Actually, here's the third ring right here, where you're growing crops and it's a little less expensive for land, but you're still pretty close to the city to get your product to market. And then in the fourth ring, you've got grazing, which requires a lot of space. Therefore, land would be the cheapest. Think about it. You need wide open spaces. Your cattle are roaming everywhere. It costs a lot of money. Far away from the city. But when you're done with your cows, you can ship them by train a long distance and they're going to last. So as you get farther and farther away from the city, you've got items that can last longer and land is cheaper. Strategies to increase the world's food supply. Number one, increase exports from countries with surpluses. For example, in response to the increasing global demand for food, the USA passed Public Law 480, the Agricultural Trade and Assistance Act of 1954. They sold the grain at low interest rates, and they give grants to needy groups of people. This is the way the United States increases the world's food supply. And in fact, the United States is still the leader in grain exports, but Latin America and Southeast Asia have had rapid increases. Here are the exports of the entire world. So we're looking at things kind of staying consistent and then slowly go up since 1980, 1990. And then, of course, 2000 to 2010 went up exponentially as far as countries exporting food to be a part of the world food supply. Here is the exporters. Here are the exporters. United States, Brazil, Argentina, Australia. We're exporting bunches of food worldwide. And then the importers. Who needs a bunch of food? Russia and China. You'd still, of course, see North African countries because there's lots of desert area there as well, and mainly lots of African countries. Another strategy to increase the world's food supply. Number two, expand the agricultural lands. Back in the day, you could keep the population growing and keep expanding, but now land is running out due to urbanization. Also, some places have land but not enough water due to desertification, where human actions have caused land to deteriorate and you can't actually grow crops there anymore. But excessive water also threatens places, which were possibly, they've ruined these farmlands because of over-irrigation. We take a look at the graph here. We've got population, which is going up and up and up over the last 50 years, but agricultural land has remained pretty much the same. That could potentially be a big problem. Here's our hazards of desertification, where you've got arid land, you're not going to be growing very many crops. Very high degree of desertification, where it's being used up. Look at all these areas around the Middle East, right near the deserts are starting to lose a lot of their lands. Northwestern and western United States, we've seen too much land be ruined. And areas where you think you got tons of reserve, still in Mexico, rainforest areas in southern Africa, lots of areas actually in portions of southwestern Russia. India, still looking like it's got a lot of area where you can work on farmland, little chance for desertification. Strategy number three, getting more food in the world, expand fishing. We can do this by capturing wild fish from the ocean or by aquaculture or aqua farming. This is the cultivation of seafood under controlled conditions. And here you can see an aqua farm right here, where they're growing fish in these tanks and holding them, so there's no real need to go out into the ocean, they just grow them themselves. Fish consumption has increased more rapidly than population growth. Fish production has increased, but a large portion goes to feeding animals. And overfishing is a big problem, because the population of some fish species have declined because they were harvested faster than they can grow. Think of specifically tuna and swordfish, big popular items as far as seafood eating. So here's aquaculture, where people are growing their own fish. It didn't really expand until after 1990, and then you start to see it take off. The total fish production, again, continues to go up and up and up and up and up and up. Whereas fishing kind of goes up as well, but it doesn't meet the demands of the total amount of fish and demand being caught. Here's fish production. United States, North America doing a lot. Brazil, a lot. Russia, China, India, Southeast Asian countries, a lot as well. Strategy number four, increase productivity. We look at something called the Green Revolution. This was the invention and rapid diffusion of more productive agricultural techniques during the 70s and 80s, where they created higher yield seeds and they expanded their use of fertilizers. Because of the Green Revolution, agricultural productivity has increased faster than population. Remember how we're worried that because population growth would be too explosive that we'd run out of food? Well, they, in a way, fixed that, where they created miracle seeds. These seeds were less sensitive to variation in the day length, and they responded better to fertilizers, and they matured faster. Consider that India had a food shortage in the 1960s, but in 1971, they had a surplus because of the techniques from the Green Revolution. In order to pull this off, though, farmers needed machines, irrigation pumps, and fertilizers. Here's the thing, though. The Green Revolution, it uses genetically modified foods. A lot of people think that's a good thing because we're creating food and it saves lives. Other people think it's a bad thing because genetically modifying crops affects what you are eating, and potentially that can be very harmful. And there's a lot of controversy on that. But genetically modified foods, or GM, genetically modified, or GMOs, genetically modified organisms, 10% of all crops are devoted to GM crops. I don't know if you realize that. GM is especially widespread. Genetically modified foods are especially widespread in the United States, with 3/4 of everything we eat having a product in it that is GM. That to me is concerning. Like, I want to have food for enough people, definitely. But I'm not sure that genetically modified food is the way to go. Again, that's just me personally, not as a teacher. I'm just throwing that out there. Opposition is, it causes health problems. You can destroy long-standing ecological balances and reduce effectiveness of antibiotics. Export problems. European countries still require labeling to say GMOs. For the most part, the United States does not require us to put made genetically modified tomatoes. We just, say, it's just food. And then along with GM, there's the increased dependence on the U.S. corporations, such as Monsanto, who manufactures the most GM crops. And they even created a terminator gene that prevents seed from regrowth, meaning if you're a poor farmer in Mexico and you go and buy seeds, you would think that you could plant them, take care of your crops, and use the seeds from those crops to regrow for next year. No. A lot of corporations like Monsanto created terminator seeds where you have to go back to Monsanto every single year and buy your seeds. You cannot use your own seeds. That's just a way of making money. Some people look at it, but the other way is that's just not sustainable. And then developing countries are dependent on the Monsanto Corporation in the United States. So that's a big concern. These labels are required in Europe and not in the United States. Sustainable agriculture. So agricultural practices that preserve and enhance the environmental quality. Farmers typically produce low revenues, but they have lower costs. The United Nations found that in 2009, 0.6% of farmland is organic. So not a lot. They utilize sensitive land management, where you have ridge tillage, where you plant crops on ridges for minimum soil disturbance. Now, it's not like a huge hill ridge. It's like, this big. Every row has got a little ridge like this. Okay, it kind of looks the same as what you might see in the United States, but it uses a lot less actual soil, and they use limited chemicals. They only use chemicals on the ridge instead of the entire field. And something else that helps is using integrated crop and livestock, where they balance the number of animals and use them to fertilize the crops. This is all ways of using sustainable agriculture. And then as you look at chapter, why does development vary among countries? So the Human Development Index, this is something that was created by the United Nations. It was supposed to measure the level of development in each country, meaning how developed are you or not. It has 3 factors associated with it. Number 1, a decent standard of living. 2, a long and healthy life. And 3, access of knowledge. Like how much are you educated? These are rated in the areas of very high, medium, and low. So for example, maybe you take Russia. So it's ranked about 7.7 on the HDI scale, meaning we're pretty high, as opposed to sub-Saharan Africa, where we're only at 0.4, just beyond 0.4. So you can see ranked by these things right here, kind of where we're developed. Obviously, when we look at developed countries such as the United States and Japan, we're very developed, approaching 1, and developing countries are lucky to get over 0.6. A decent standard of living. This is one of the aspects that we're looking at for your HDI. Income. We look at gross national income, or GNI. This is the value of output of goods and services in 1 year, including money that leaves and enters the country. Another aspect of income is gross domestic product, or GDP. This is the value of output of goods and services in a country for a year, but does not account for money leaving a country. So the difference between these two, because it gets very confusing, is GDP does not account for money leaving a country. So no money leaving. Then we also have purchasing power parity, or PPP. This is the adjustment to the GNI to account for costs of goods. For example, do you want to calculate an individual person? We take the GNI divided by total population. So for the United States in 2011, the GNI was 15 trillion. We divide that by the population, which was 312 million. That equals 47,000. So that's the adjusted gross national income per person. So for example, a person in the United States, most likely in 2011, the average is going to be $47,000. As opposed to looking at the GNI of developed countries overall, the GNI is 34,000. In developing countries, they only make 7,000. You can see how big the gap is there, just based on those numbers. Economic structure. The primary sector. This is people who directly extract materials from the earth through agricultural, mining, fishing, and forestry. The GNI is decreased in developed countries, but it remains high in developing countries. So we look at developed countries, such as the United States. We're not doing a lot of primary sector activities these days because we're developed and we tend to be doing things that are more down here in the tertiary sector. We'll get to that though. So in developing countries, it remains high because they don't have the technology and infrastructure. So they're doing all these basic things like agricultural, mining, fishing, and forestry. Plus, they also tend to have a lot of these resources. Secondary sector. These are manufacturers that process, transform, assemble raw materials into useful products and consumer goods. The GNI is sharply decreased in developed countries. Again, in developed countries, we're not doing a lot of secondary sector activities. We're not doing a lot of processing or transforming or assembling raw materials anymore because we're developed. So we see that decreased for places like the United States and Japan. The tertiary sector. This is the provision of goods and services in exchange for payment like retailing, banking, law, education, and government. The GNI is large in developed countries and it continues to grow. That makes sense, right? We're highly developed, so we're going to be doing a lot of things that are associated with banking, law, education, and government. Productivity. Workers in developed countries are more productive than in developed countries. That seems kind of biased there, but let's face it. In developed countries, we have lots of infrastructure, we have technologies, and we are highly trained. So as far as productivity, we can get more done with less. Productivity is the value of a particular product compared to the amount of labor needed to make it. It's measured by the value added per capita or per person, which is what per capita means. Value added, this is the gross value of a product minus the cost of raw materials and energy. So, for example, if you have a product, but it takes a lot of money to get it created or materials to get it created, then that's going to be minus the value added. So we look at, in 2010, the United States has a value added of 5,900, meaning we get a lot more value from the skill and the productivity of the people in our country because we can do more with less. Japan is even more so. In China, there's not tons of value added because people aren't as skilled and it takes a lot more to reach the market. India, same thing. Inequality adjusted HDI. So we know what HDI. Well, this is speaking to inequality adjusted HDI. This is the indicator of development that modifies the HDI to account for inequality in a country. So do we have perfect equality? Then the HDI and IHDI are the same. If the IHDI, is lower, inequality exists. So, of course, we're going to get the lowest scores in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia because in these places you have a lot of disparity, lack of infrastructure, you've got gender bias, and they're still developing countries. Consumer goods. Part of the wealth is generated. It's developed countries used to purchase goods and services, especially important are transportation and communications. So as far as consumer goods, some of the things that are most important are transportation and communications. We look at motor vehicles. Motor vehicles give us access to jobs, and they allow us to distribute our products efficiently and independently. Telephones, they enhance interaction with providers of raw materials and customers of goods and services. If we don't have access to telephones, it makes it really difficult to do business. And computers, of course, that's how we communicate and share information with buyers and suppliers. So much so these days, even more than telephones. So here we see motor vehicles in these countries. Obviously, North America is jam-packed. Europe is jam-packed with motor vehicles. That gives them an advantage because we're able to take our goods and services everywhere or go buy our goods and services. We look at internet users per 1,000 people. In developed countries, like everybody's having the internet. Developing countries, it's still up and coming. You can see that it's going to make it more difficult to advance, to be developed as a society, to compete in a global market if we don't have the internet. We're not able to communicate. We're not able to buy and sell. We're not able to keep up with current trends. A long and healthy life. Health is considered an important measure of development. A goal of development is to provide nutrition and medical services for people to live a long and healthy life. Life expectancy. This is a contributor to HDI, the Human Development Index. The average life expectancy is 70. In developed countries and regions, it's 80. So in the United States, we're expected to live longer. In developing countries, it's only about 68 because they don't have infrastructure, they lack healthcare, they lack education. So they're not able to provide as much health for their people as they can in developed countries. In Latin America, we're looking at about 75 life expectancy. In South Asia, you're expected to only make it to 65 years old. In Sub-Saharan Africa, where they're really limited on their resources, life expectancy is only 55. Can you believe that? That's approaching what it was, during colonial periods, medieval periods. Infants, 94% survive in developing countries. 99.5% survive in developed countries. So pretty much, if you're being born in a developed country, the likelihood is you're going to survive as an infant. Access to knowledge. There's two parts to this: quantity and quality. Access to knowledge meaning how long are you going to school? The average globally is 7 years. In developed countries, it's 11 years of school. In developing countries, it's only 6 years of school. In the future, the United Nations expects kids in developed countries to graduate from college with an average of 16 years of schooling, but only 11 years in developed countries. Quality is the other aspect of it. What's the pupil to teacher ratio? How many kids are in your classroom? Is it 20 kids for every one teacher, or is it way more than that? That affects the quality of schooling. Literacy rate. How many people can read? How many people can write? If you can't do either, you could be going to school for 10 years, but you're not getting a good quality of schooling. So we look at the average years of schooling here. United States, Europe, you start to see, Australia, you start to see the most. You wonder why people aren't having as much success in infrastructure and they're not as developed. Looking at Sub-Saharan Africa, we can see why, because they're not going to school very long. Percent literate, can they read and write? Europe, people mostly can read and write. North America, South America is filling in nicely. And of course, Russia and Australia are doing great as well. These are all factors that go into the development index. Within the development index, of course, looking at countries, you have variations within countries and certain regions. Within regions, for example, Southwest Asia and North Africa, they have huge desert areas and they can't really support life. Except you look at countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they have access to petroleum. So they're able to thrive because they have the money to create infrastructure, education, and healthcare. It's extremely limited for countries like Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and others. Countries, variations within countries. You look at the United States and you think we're pretty wealthy and developed, which we are, but there's still variation. We're very wealthy in the Northeast, but much poorer in the Southeast. You think about back to the course of our history, why might that be? Well, the Northeast developed a lot faster. They had industry. Think about the Civil War. What happened? We've got plantations and industry built on agriculture. That was devastated because we didn't have industry like the North did. That still kind of continues to this day. You've got Brazil, where it's wealthy along the Atlantic coast, but lower in the interior rainforest. So looking at Brazil here, we've got areas where you got major cities here that are highly developed. As you go up into the rainforest, it's varied extremely over the region. China's the same thing. It's wealthy along the East Coast, but it's got problems in the desert and in the mountains. So we look at China. Here's all the East Coast. We got the major cities, but then as we get rural, and we're releasing a lot of variation and disparity. Mexico, they're going to be highly developed at the border. Well, they're much more developed at the border. There's variation because at the border, there are people access to jobs. They have maquiladoras or plants where people are working, and then down here, away from the United States, it's definitely varied. That's our look at chapter. Welcome to AP Human Geography, Chapter 9, Key Issue 2. Why does development vary by gender? So gender inequality measures. The United Nations hasn't found a single country where women are treated as well as men. The Gender Inequality Index, or GII. The higher the GII, the more inequality in a country. A score of 0 means men and women are equal. A score of 1 means it's very unequal. And factors that go into making this GII include empowerment, labor, and reproductive health. So we see areas where inequality is pretty high. And nowhere do you see it perfect. But you can see where it gets pretty uneven in Northern Africa, some countries in the Middle East. And, we ask maybe why is that occurring there? Some of that's infrastructure, a lot of it's based off of social norms and religious practices. United States is one of the better countries, but again, it's not 100%. It's not completely equal. Empowerment. This is one of the factors that goes into equality. Empowerment, the ability of women to achieve improvements in their own status, their economic and political power. Empowerment deals with the percentage of women in national legislature. How many of them are working in government? Although women vote more, no country has a higher number of women than men right now. So what we're saying is, you look at the government, how many women are there that have been voted into office or who are in control? And so far, we don't have an equal number. But, you do have countries that are greater than others, who have more equality than others. So we're looking at the percentage of seats held by women in legislature. Obviously, the darker countries are the ones where you're seeing a lot more equality. Think about Australia. Interestingly enough, China, many Eastern European countries. Canada has even more than the United States. And we look at the percentage of women completing high school. In developing countries, many more boys than girls graduate. It makes sense when we're thinking about traditionally countries coming into development. Where do we see women graduating high school? Well, we're seeing that commonly, of course, in the United States. In multiple countries are up and coming, such as Brazil and Argentina in South America. You look at countries in Scandinavia, which have a really great record of education, and many say even better than the United States, such as Sweden, Norway, and Finland. They are having lots of women graduate secondary education. But again, you're not seeing it in Sub-Saharan Africa and lots of portions of Southern and Southeastern Asia. And let's wait a moment while my screen loads, and I'll tell you a story. Oh, darn it. You don't get to hear my story. Okay, so make sure we got the same page. Okay. The next thing dealing with empowerment is labor force. The female labor force participation rate. This is the percentage of women holding full-time jobs outside the home. It's 75% women, it's 75 women out of 100 men in developed countries, meaning we're getting a lot closer here. Sure, we're still short, but we're moving forward. 65 women to 100 men in developing countries. So we still have some more room to progress. Consider in Southwest Asia and North Africa, only the rates are going to be like 35 women out of 100 men are going to be employed. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it's actually better because you've got 77 women out of 100 men, or in relation to 100 men working, because what's going on in Sub-Saharan Africa is they're working in agriculture, and you need both parties to feed all the mouths that are required for all the high-level families that you got going on in Sub-Saharan Africa. So again, Southwest Asia, North Africa, we're looking at not that many women being employed. And we ask the question, well, why is that? A lot of it has to do with infrastructure and education, but sometimes it's based off of religious preferences and social norms. In these countries, it's not common for the women to be going to school because it's mainly focused on just the men. reproductive health. So we look at the maternal mortality ratio. This is the number of women who die giving birth per 100,000. In developed countries, you'll see 15 women die out of 100,000. In developing, excuse me, make sure I said that right. In developed countries, you'll see 15 women out of 100,000 that will die in giving birth. In developing countries, you've got a bigger number. 140 women die in childbirth out of 100,000. So we look at which countries are doing better as far as equality. Well, the ones that are making sure that healthcare is going to their women, and it's dropping the rate who are dying in childbirth. The adolescent fertility rate. This is the number of births per 1,000 women, ages 15 to 19. So if you're an adolescent, you're considered between the ages of 15 and 19 for childbearing. People tend not to want to see women these ages giving birth because the chances for success and job workforce and a healthy backdrop to take care of the child tends to be less and less. When you have adolescent fertility, a lot of the times it's because of inequality, where women are seen as people who are just supposed to give birth. So when you look at this perspective and you see it across the earth here, it really is one more factor that helps you understand the equality in a country. So in developed countries, you're seeing 20 women per 1,000 give birth in ages 15 to 19, as opposed to in developing countries, it's going to be a much larger number, 3 times as much. At 60 women between the ages of 15 and 19 are getting pregnant. In Europe, that number is only about 8, which is pretty low. In sub-Saharan Africa, of course, the number is huge. It's over 100 because we're not treating women equally. We're not having infrastructure or education about pregnancy. We're not using birth control methods. So this is a big factor at looking at equality. The gender inequality, the trends that go along with it. The United Nations has found that in nearly every country, inequality has gone down since the 1990s, which that's good, right? The greatest improvements have been made to Southwest Asia and in North Africa. Again, these are places that we've been talking about right here. We're seeing improvement in how women are treated as equals or not. In the United States, the gender inequality index has actually increased because of the maternal mortality rate and the low number of women in legislature. I'm just not getting done today. I apologize. I can't talk. But I want to because you guys deserve a great video. So we look at the United States and we wonder, well, wait a minute, why has the GII increased? Well, the mortality rate has increased, meaning it's a few more women have been dying in childbirth because perhaps they don't have access to healthcare. Let's face it, we have outstanding healthcare in this country, but not everyone has access because they can't pay for it. They don't have insurance. The other portion of it is we've got a low number of women in legislature. So a lot of men who are in government control here. So we still have a ways to go as far as being equal in this country. And that's a look at Chapter 9, Key Issue 2. From developing, well, there's 2 paths to development. There's a gap between the developed and developing countries, and it is significant. Poor countries lack what rich countries take for granted, such as safe drinking water, electricity, and paved roads. These 2 different paths. Number 1 is self-sufficiency. This is where countries encourage domestic production of goods, discourage foreign ownership of businesses, resources, and they limit international competition. Basically, they want to do everything within their own country. And then there's the international trade approach. This is where countries open themselves to foreign investment and international markets. The self-sufficiency path. They put up barriers to limit the import of goods from other places. Businesses are isolated from competition with large international corporations. Investment is spread as equally as possible across all sectors of the economy. And incomes in the country keep pace with those in the city. They focus on reducing poverty or wealth of a few. So you think about this could be a really cool way to go to where you're not, paying companies from other countries to come in and the profits are staying within your country and you're giving back to your people. So this could be a good idea, right? Well, our case study here is India after its independence in 1947. They made foreign companies go through a long process to secure a license, meaning their companies within their country would have a greater chance to succeed before those foreign countries came in. They restricted the sale of foreign goods in their country. They placed heavy taxes on imported goods. Indian businesses discouraged from exporting goods, meaning they wanted Indian businesses to make products for Indian people, so you'd be benefiting everyone in your country. Indian money couldn't be converted to other currencies. So, for example, if you wanted to buy something in US dollars, they said, you know what, we're not going to let that happen. Indian businesses need permission to sell a new product, modernize a factory, expand production, set prices, hire and fire workers. Now, this is where it starts to be kind of ridiculous, right? If we're going to be able to create innovation and have a thriving, growing product, how in the world can we get that done in the self-sufficiency path if we're this restricted? We definitely can see why they might need to do these things. Like if you modernize a factory, that probably means you're going to have new technology in it and less workers. So in order to take care of your workers, the government attempted to reduce that from happening. In one sense, you're caring for your workers. On the other sense, you're just going to be far, far behind. Indian companies were also subsidized by the government if they did not make a profit. Chapter 9 continues to tongue-tie me. I'm so sorry. So an Indian company, if it's not doing very well, and in fact it's losing money, in order to save the workers and continue that company, the government would come in and give them more money to keep everything sustainable. Here's a different path, the international trade path. This is where you have country identify their distinctive assets to create in abundance to sell to other countries. So for example, if you've got a country that's really, really great at creating technology, they're going to put everything into that. They're not going to do anything else. They're going to focus on technology, get really good and really cheap at that so that they can have other countries buy their stuff. And for example, if they needed oil, then they would sell their technologies and buy the oil. This is the international trade approach. So as far as the Rostow model, you've got 5 parts of it. Traditional society. These are stages, if you will, of development. So in a traditional society, there is no development. You've got farming and agricultural, and money is spent mostly on military and religion. The second step in the international trade approach is preconditions for takeoff. This is where an elite group initiates economic activities, and the country starts to invest in new technology and infrastructure. Then is takeoff, where you have rapid growth generated by limited industries such as textiles or food. In stage 4, you have a drive to maturity, where modern technologies diffuse to a wide variety of industries, and you have skilled and specialized workers. And then stage 5 is the age of mass consumption, where the economy shifts from industry to consumer goods. No longer are we building steel beams. Now we're buying things like PlayStations and Xboxes. Seriously, iPhones and iPads and computers. Examples. The international trade approach created the 4 Asian dragons. So you've got these areas, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. They had virtually no natural resources, so they had to come up with a way of getting income coming into the country. So they produce a handful of manufactured goods, especially clothing and electronics. You think about it. Whenever you buy clothing or electronics, a lot of the time these are the countries that it came from, specifically back when I was a kid, definitely. So they created these products like clothes and electronics, and they sold them, made them cheap and sold them so that other countries would buy them so they could use that money to buy resources that they needed, like, oil, petroleum, steel. Other example are the petroleum-rich Arabian Peninsula states. Once these areas were the least developed, they were transformed overnight into the richest and most populous using petroleum revenue. So you think about Saudi Arabia or UAE, where it's pretty much just like a desert country with highly underdeveloped peoples. And then utilizing their one resource, which is petroleum, they became super developed very, very quickly. The shortcomings of these development paths. Well, as far as being self-sufficient or staying to yourself as a country, it's really inefficient for business, because why would you improve your business if even when you fail, the government gives you money? There's not a lot of incentive there. Other problem is there's a need for a large bureaucracy. So remember in India, when they had these documents that everyone had to fill out to do any kind of changes, well, this creates long, slow processes where it's very expensive and unnecessary. So on the one hand, sure, you're protecting your people and you're protecting your businesses in your country. On the other hand, if you're creating a product, it's not going to be a very good product because you have to go through all these long, slow processes and paperwork and people to get anything changed. On the international trade approach, the challenges are uneven resource distribution, meaning, think about it. Who gets all the benefit? If you've got these resources here in Africa, who's going to benefit? Let's take it the way it is, right? It's the United States. It's countries in Europe that are taking advantage. They're going in, even Japan, they're going in, they're getting these resources. They're giving some money back to the countries in Africa, but really the profits are going back to these core countries. Other challenges, the increased dependence on developed countries. So if you are a developing country in Southwest Asia and you're creating clothes and you're selling those clothes to make some kind of a profit to Europe and the United States, what happens if the United States kind of goes through an economic downturn? So are you. Because if these guys stop buying your Nike shorts, your Nike apparel, and that's all you're making, you got problems because now you have no money coming in. You're dependent on these developed countries. Market decline. If the whole market goes down and people aren't buying as much, you have no other income. If you were depending on the sale of your Prada purses, or I don't know what's made of here, if you're depending on your sale of electronics and the market declines, how are you going to buy oil to use for your trucks and vehicles? It's going to be difficult. International trade triumphs. Developing countries with abundance of raw materials benefited from the income of developed countries. In the past, colonial powers simply took what they wanted. So in one sense, think about it over the course of history, when you had the United Kingdom go into Africa, and they just took what they wanted. They didn't give anything back to African countries or India or whatever. They just took it. So now it's a step in the right direction to where on the international trade approach, you do have some profit and some control going back to countries like India. Other things, you have competition with the outside markets, and that makes products within your country better. If you have two products in your country, like a purse, for example, if you have one purse which is made in your country and one purse which is made from an outside country, and the purse in the outside country is cheaper and better quality, guess what your citizens are going to buy? So your country's company that makes the purse has to get better. So competition, in that sense, is healthy. Consider India in the 1990s after switching from self-sufficiency to the international trade model. Foreign countries came into India and set up factories. They lifted the import-export tariffs. Monopolies were eliminated, meaning there was healthy competition, and Indian companies improved. So the international trade seems to be a really good way to go. I mean, it's kind of one perspective here that's written by Rubenstein and the creators of our textbook. But from this perspective, it seems like international trade is great. And in fact, you can see India here on the graph where their per capita change is going up and up and up. I mean, in one sense, I guess it is a lot higher here. But, international trade does allow for healthy competition and the free movement of goods and services. The World Trade Organization, it was formed in 1995, created to promote international trade. It works to reduce barriers by negotiating the idea of eliminating quotas and tariffs, as well as stopping restrictions on movement of money by banks, corporations, and wealthy individuals. It enforces agreements between countries, and it protects intellectual property. So what the World Trade Organization does is it says, okay, countries, we want you to remove all of the barriers. We want to do free trade, and we want to communicate, and we want to allow money to move freely, which is good. But at the same time, if you've got a country that is benefiting from this free trade of goods and services and a country where resources are being taken, then it becomes a problem. And in fact, you can see protesters here in South Korea who are against the World Trade Organization because they argue it's anti-democratic because the decisions promote large corporations rather than poor people. And this compromises the sovereignty of individual countries. For example, if you are a country that's submitting to the World Trade Organization and the World Trade says, you know what, you need to drop your tariffs. You can no longer charge more for goods and services coming into your country. Guess what? You have to do it. So if you wanted to protect your workers in your country, by saying, let's make our goods and services cheaper, you can't, because the World Trade Organization says you have to have equal distribution. So in that sense, it's a real problem. Financing development. You've got a lot of developing countries that don't have money. So they're going to get it in two ways. Number one is a foreign direct investment. This is an investment made by a company in the economy of another country. This commonly happens to be a transnational corporation. So you've got a company, say it's Walmart. They come in to a country in South America and they're like, all right, we're going to invest in your country. We're going to build infrastructure. We're going to create a lot of our distribution centers where you guys are selling bananas and fruits and all that stuff. And we're going to spend a lot of money here. So in a sense, that's a good way for their people to be developed. The other way is through loans. And two places that countries can get loans is from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Again, it's just like being a person in debt here in the United States. If you come out of college and you owe money to your college, you have to pay it back. If you go to buy a house in the United States, you have to pay it back. The trouble is with these developing countries, half the projects funded by the World Bank have failed because it's really difficult to have a country full of people that aren't as skilled as people in developed countries to pay back the money because you'll have faulty engineering. Let's say you borrowed millions of dollars to create power plants for your country. Guess who's going to be engineering those plants? People from your country. And if you're still developing, you don't necessarily have the skill for those workers to know how to build or maintain the plant. In governments from developing countries, a lot of the times the money is squandered or stolen. It's spent on like military instead of schools or hospitals. And a lot of times when countries borrow money, this new infrastructure they built, it didn't end up attracting other investment. So let's say you've got a country that borrows millions of dollars from the International Monetary Fund to build hospitals, roads, and communication lines, thinking that when they do that, USA and Great Britain will come in and build new plants because it'll be cheaper than the United States. So you get this debt, you build all this infrastructure, and then nobody comes to your country. for whatever reason, now you're in trouble because you don't have the money to pay back what you borrowed for these loans. So many countries are unable to repay the interest on their loans, let alone the principal. Meaning, if you borrow money, there's the money you borrowed, which is the principal, and the interest, which is, let's say it's 6%, meaning you've got to pay back $1 million plus 6% that the bank is charging you to get that money. So many countries are so poor they can't even pay the interest, which is very, very small, let alone this huge debt amount. Financing challenges in developed countries. To apply for debt relief, a developing country is required to prepare a policy framework paper. It outlines a structural adjustment program where economic goals, strategies for achieving objectives, and external financing requirements are lined out. This structural adjustment program for developing countries, it talks about spending only what it can afford, directly benefiting the poor and not just the elite, diverting money away from spending on military to health and education. It talks about investing resources where they will have the most impact. It encourages a more productive private sector instead of depending on the government. And it talks about actually reforming the government. So these seem like very good things. You want to give money, but you want to have a plan for how to use it most effectively. The problem is with these structural adjustment programs is that poverty worsens, where they actually see cuts in health and education, even though the plan was to give more to health and education. They see higher unemployment. They see a loss of government jobs, because if you're reforming government, a lot of times that ends up happening is cutting government because so much money is spent on government. So with that comes a loss of government jobs, and there ends up being less support for the poor. And you can see this protest right here, where you've got people holding up the banner that says the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they make a few people rich because of these loans and billions in these countries poor. Financing challenges in developed countries. Well, in 2008, an example is this huge economic downturn because of the housing bubble. Developed countries were hit very hard, but that also spilled over into developing countries. So pretty much the entire earth was hit. In developed countries, we have a huge issue with widening inequality. Since 1980, inequality increased in developed countries. In the United States, consider that the richest 1%, a very small amount of people, they hold 20% of the wealth. This equates to 421 billionaires. They hold 10% of the wealth. Think about that. 421 people. How many millions do we have in this country? I think it's like 312 million. So 421 people hold 10% of the wealth. That's how wealthy they are. People are frustrated with this unfair advantage with these very large banks and financial institutions, especially back in 2008 when they were rescued by the government, because these banks that were bailed out, they quickly returned to making substantial profits, but the incomes of average Americans, it kept going down. So this is a big issue, because it's very frustrating that 1% of the people have so much. I don't think these people are saying at all that, they disagree with the idea of people working hard and getting money. I think what happens is, because people get more money, people have more political power, and more loopholes are given to them to where they get more and more and more money, whereas average Americans have less and less. In fact, you take a look at this graph here of the average after-tax income by people in the United States. So you've got down here average workers, and it all seems pretty normal, right? You have the rich people up here still in 1979. They're making more than us, but okay, it stays kind of consistent. We're all going down the line here through to the 2000s making pretty much the same. So these are the poorest people. These are, people that are making more money. These are the top 5 and 10%. Okay. But consider the top 1%. This 421 billionaires is an example of that. As we moved up through into the 2000s, their earning power, their money, their income increased exponentially. So look at how big this gap is now. To where, consider it, the income, the salary of a teacher, it didn't go up that much. But top executives, it went way up. Meaning there's a lot of money that could have been given back to people who are in the average income brackets. World financial issues. Look at Europe's sovereign debt crisis. This leads to questions about the international trade development path. So most countries in Europe have the euro, but the downturn proved to be a burden to prosperous countries, siding with poor countries. You think about Greece, they're really hurting still. Greece is supported by richer countries in the European Union, and that tends to be a problem for the richer countries because they don't want to have to foot the bill for a country that's really struggling. Germany had a strong economy producing cars and electronics. They were higher quality and lower cost than in Italy. But because both were in the European Union and both had the euro, Italy had no way of competing economically. Like, they couldn't increase their euro because it was a euro and it was used throughout the continent of Europe. So because they're within the euro, there's nothing they can do. Another issue was the housing bubble, where we had a rapid increase of house values followed by a sharp decline. This collapse in 2008 happened because banks and financial institutions lent money to businesses and individuals who just couldn't repay. The housing market was so huge, housing was so expensive, and people were giving out loans like crazy. And then they started to see that people couldn't actually afford their loans, and people couldn't pay it, and so everything crashed. I remember working at a company, and we used to get bids for events, and we could put out, whatever bid we wanted in 2006, 2007. People would just pay it, huge amounts of money. And 2008 hit, and everybody was conserving money, and we definitely felt the impact in our industry. This is before I became a teacher. Fair trade. So we look at fair trade. This is where we have commerce in which products are made and traded according to standards that protect workers and small businesses in developing countries. There's standards that are created to protect the workers. Producer standards, where you have much larger portions go to the producer, like the grower of bananas or the creator of the dresses. Cooperatives are managed democratically. Like, you don't have just one CEO that's in charge of everything. Everyone's in charge. And consumers pay a higher price, but understand the benefits. Meaning, if you buy shampoo at a fair trade price, you know that you're paying a little bit higher, but you feel like the benefits go back to the people and it's probably higher quality. Worker standards within fair trade. Workers are paid fair wages. They have unions and they comply with safety standards. Meaning, we're taking care of the people. People can band together and complain when situations where money isn't right, and they can stand together. Our example is coffee. Buying fair trade coffee may cost more, but grown organically, it's safer. It doesn't have these byproducts in it, and it's commonly higher quality, so people are willing to pay it. Microfinance is also a way to create development. This is where you have really small loans to individuals and small businesses in developing countries who are unable to obtain loans from commercial banks. Examples are Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, who specializes in microloans to women, where they're buying things like cows, perfume. They're binding books, and they're selling matches, mirrors, and bananas. These are very small things, but they don't have that money. So if they could just get a few dollars, they can create a business for themselves. Only 1% of the borrowers failed to repay their loans. This is extraordinarily low for a bank. So this is a great setup, these microfinances. The average loan is $60, but the lowest has been $1. Think about what $1 could do for these people starting their own businesses in these countries. So we're making progress in development. The infant mortality rate, this is the gap between developed and developing countries, has narrowed since 1980. So in developed countries, it's dropped from 17 to 6. And in developing countries, the mortality rate for infants has dropped from 107 all the way down to 44. So we are making progress. Life expectancy increased by 8 years, but it also increased by 8 years in developed countries as well. So that's good because life expectancy is going up everywhere, but the gap just didn't decrease between the both. So we are making progress there. The GNI per capita, this is the gap in wealth between developed and developing countries, is widened because we see the GNI in developed countries increasing from 20 to 33,000. You've got it going way up in developing countries. It's increasing from 1,000 to 5,000, but look, it's still a huge, huge gap there. So we are making progress as far as developing everywhere, but we still have these gaps. So our millennial development goals. The United Nations, to reduce disparities between developed and developing countries, has set 8 goals. Number 1 is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Number 2 is to achieve universal and primary education. Number 3 is to promote gender equality and empower women. Number 4 is to reduce child mortality. Number 5 is to improve maternal health. Number 6 is to combat AIDS and other diseases. Number 7 is to ensure environmental sustainability. And number 8 is to develop a global partnership for development. Now look, all of these sound really, really good. And of course they are. My only caution is, as a teacher of AP Human Geography and an individual, is that be very careful about giving away our sovereignty as a nation to the United Nations, because if we allow the United Nations to make laws about our country, then we lose our ability to govern ourselves. So be very careful of that. And that honestly could get me in trouble as a teacher, but I put that caveat out there because all of these things sound very, very important. We just want to make sure that we maintain our freedom and do them the right way. Core and periphery, the world systems theory. We're going to finish it up with this. This is the relationship between developed and developing countries as depicted by Wallerstein, a US social scientist. What he saw was an increasing unified world economy where developed countries are at the inner core and developing countries occupy the peripheral. So here's the inner core of developed countries. They're taking all the wealth, and it's all being stolen from the periphery countries right here. This is uneven development, where you've got countries at the core, they benefit at the expense of countries in the periphery. That's our school bell, I apologize there. So the interesting thing about this map here of the core and periphery is that Rubenstein states that it is an unorthodox projection. It's unorthodox because guess what? It is the azimuthal projection. It is the flat earth. That's right. It's interesting because Rubenstein makes sure to state 3 times that it's unorthodox, and yet he still uses it. So I won't go into the rest of that today, but here it is. These countries are benefiting. These countries in the periphery are getting resources and everything taken from them. That's the idea of Wallerstein's world systems theory. That's key issue 4 distributed. Let's jump in. Before, you've got this cottage industry where people are making things in their own homes. They're creating tools like for use in their garden or on the farm. They pretty much have to do it themselves. Maybe even going to a local store to buy something, but there's definitely not a huge mechanized industrial process. In the late 1700s, we began the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom. And this is a series of improvements in industrial technology that transformed the process of manufacturing goods. And it began in the United Kingdom for a number of different reasons. But one of them is the overabundance of coal. People used to have to use wood to heat their ovens, and that was very time-consuming, inefficient, and you couldn't keep the ovens heated as consistently and efficiently. So in the United Kingdom, they had an abundance of coal, so they switched over to that fuel, and they were able to utilize their ovens for melting steel a lot better. In fact, in the late 1700s, here, when the Industrial Revolution begins, you have iron, something that takes a long time to heat the ovens consistently with wood, but with the invention of Watt's steam engine, it efficiently and cheaply heats ovens over an extended period of time. So iron becomes a product that is easily manipulated and created. So again, we went from wood to coal, and that was something else that helped Europe explode in England as far as the Industrial Revolution. For transportation, we started to dig canals, and we built tons of railroads to transfer goods. Again, because of iron, we were able to build lots more railroads faster and more efficiently. Textiles, clothing. This factory system was spawned on in 1786 by Richard Arkwright, who invented the machine to untangle cotton. If you're having a machine that's able to do this for you, you can create fabric so much faster. Chemicals. Before chemicals, people used to have to find dyes in nature out of natural plants and substances and apply it to individual pieces of fabric. Like you wanted a colored t-shirt, you have to do that yourself out of some natural like colors found in nature. But with the invention of chemicals in 1746 by John Roebuck and Samuel Garbett, they created a factory that dyed these fabrics with sulfuric acid and burning coal. Obviously, the process there is kind of dangerous, and sulfuric acid is horrible for the human system. So during this time, there's a lot of inventions and change, and yet the health issues weren't really that great. However, it is moving the industry forward. So now they can create shirts of any color very quickly and efficiently because of these chemicals that they invented. And then food processing. In 1810, Nicholas Appert started canning food in glass bottles. So no longer did you have to get like some eggs and transport them quickly over a long period of time. Well, not necessarily eggs. Let's think of something else. I don't know. Like ham. So ham would spoil over, sitting out over a number of days, not that long. But when Appert created food processing, he would put ham in glass bottles and store it that way, and it could be transported over long distances, and it would last a much longer amount of time. So if you think about it, now we've created a whole food industry where you can create food, store it, and ship it all across the world. Europe, what are their industrial regions? Well, you've got the United Kingdom. They used to dominate the steel and textile industries in the 19th century. Now, because they're a developed nation, they dominate high tech. The Rhine-Ruhr Valley, iron and steel manufacturing are created there due to its proximity to large coal fields. Mid-Rhine, we're talking about Germany area here. The Mid-Rhine, Frankfurt, this is a city. Frankfurt is the financial and commercial center and hub of the transportation network. Stuttgart specializes in high-value goods. Mannheim manufactures synthetic fibers, dyes, and pharmaceuticals. Down into the Po Basin, they have a huge textile industry due to low-wage workers and access to inexpensive hydroelectric power. They get a lot of water flowing. It makes it cheap to get electricity to their plants. Northeastern Spain, Catalonia is Spain's textile industry and motor vehicle plant. Moscow, moving up into Russia now. This is a huge industrial region in the capital city. St. Petersburg, Russia, it specializes in shipbuilding. Why might that be? Well, they're right on the coast there. The Urals, proximity to minerals attracted steel, machinery, and metal fabricating plants. The Ural Mountains, Russia, it's got tons of resources and things embedded in their country there, so they're always going to be a contender. Volga, it's the largest petroleum and natural gas fields and tons of minerals in the Ural Mountain range. Kuznetsk, its large reserves of coal and iron ore supply the important manufacturing district. Donetsk, one of the world's largest coal reserves in eastern Ukraine. And Cilicia, it's a growing industrial region due to skilled but low-wage workforce and proximity to wealthy markets. Here's a look at the graphic. We're talking about Europe's industrial centers here. We've got the Ural Mountains here, Russia. They're always going to have tons of minerals and supplies and resources, so they're always going to be contenders on the world stage. St. Petersburg, shipbuilding, they're right on the coast here. Germany, back into Europe here. They're major cities, Frankfurt, Mannheim, Stuttgart, leading financial centers to this day, the major influence on world financial systems. Northeastern Spain, we're talking about vehicle production, and on into the United Kingdom. North America, what are our industrial regions? We've got New England. It used to be the cotton textile center in the early 19th century. If you think about before the Civil War in the early 1800s, right? We know we've got textiles going on here in the United States, up in New England. Middle Atlantic, it's the largest U.S. market. It attracts industry that needs to be close to consumers. So if we got these major cities here on the Middle Atlantic with tons and millions of people, it's going to be the largest market. You can sell your goods to people. There's tons of people there. Mohawk Valley, it's the industrial center. It takes advantage of inexpensive electricity from Niagara Falls. A bunch of water flowing. You can make electricity very cheaply and efficiently. Pittsburgh, Lake Erie, it's leading steel production in the 19th century due to its proximity to the Appalachian coal and iron ore in the mountains there. But the steel moved on westward to the Western Great Lakes. It's the hub of the transportation network, and it's now the center of steel production. You think about trains and airplanes out of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, all the cattle being rolled into the processing plants over railroads in Chicago. That's the Western Great Lakes region. Southern California, a lot of variable industry production there with clothing, textiles, furniture, food processing. And southeastern Ontario is Canada's largest industrial area because it's close to the U.S. markets, and it has the Great Lakes and Niagara Falls for hydropower. There's a graphic. So we're looking at the largest market here. Of course, we've got major cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. What you used to have is the center for steel in Pittsburgh here. Proximity to coal in the Appalachian Mountains has now moved west to Detroit, Chicago, and Milwaukee along the Great Lakes right there. And then way out west, of course, we've got Los Angeles, which is the center for many industrial things like textiles and a different variety. Asia, their industrial regions. We think of Japan. It became an industrial power in the 1950s and 60s by producing goods sold in large quantities at cut rate prices to other countries. So back in my day, when I was a kid, Japan was the place to get your technology from because they did it cheaply and very, very well put together. Made in the USA has always been around, but it wasn't until like when I was a kid in the 80s where you started to buy things that were Japanese because they were better, well thought out and cheaper. China. We think of them now as supplying a whole bunch of things for worldwide consumption. They are the largest supply of low-cost labor. They're the largest market for consumer products, and they're big on manufacturing on the East Coast. So China's going to be a contender now, guys. They already are because they're the largest market. If you're going to sell something, no longer is it primarily going to be in the United States. Now it's going to be China because they have so many people that they're going to be able to buy. They got huge purchasing power. And South Korea, they're focused on export-oriented manufacturers, and they're the leading producer of ships. Here's the graphic. So we just said South Korea, the leading producer of ships. Of course, they're right there on the Pacific Ocean. Tokyo, Japan, technologies, and China with things up here in the Yangtze River Valley and on the East Coast here. And Hong Kong, major industrial centers in Asia. And that's a look at Chapter 11, Key Issue 1. 11, Key Issue 2, where we look at why are situation and site factors important. So industries, where the heck are they located and why are they there? In order to figure this out, we look at site and situation factors. A site factor is a unique characteristic of a location. Is it on a river? Is it on a mountain? Is it in a desert? That's site factor. Or situation factors. What are the situations? How difficult is it going to be for us to transport materials to and from the factory? What's the situation? Well, if we can use a river to get there, that's going to be great. If we can use the rail systems, that's going to be great. If not, we may have problems with our situation factors. So the proximity to inputs, situation factors. The optimal plant location is near inputs if cost of transporting is high. So for example, if we've got coal, maybe right here, maybe right near that, non-much and much. So turn down to how much of this is there it is. Engagement rings. Never mind, we can't check it out. I want you to look that up yourself. Engagement rings are a scam. It's a cool YouTube video because it talks about how the De Beers company pretty much bought out all the other diamond companies. And rubies used to be the most important. If you love someone, you would buy them a ruby. Well, the De Beers diamond company, they formed a monopoly pretty much and promoted that if you love someone, you got to give them a diamond. So that now, anytime you get engaged or married or whatever, you're buying diamonds. This is why this guy's saying engagement rings are a scam because really they have no intrinsic value. They're just like some rock that a company wanted you to buy. That's a cool thought when we're thinking about site situation factors. Okay, so we're looking at some of our mineral deposits here throughout the earth. And if we're looking, so much of what we see is based in Russia and China, where they've got tons of both non-metallic and ferrous minerals. So if we're looking for resources and minerals, I mean, this is going to be a great area. Russia's always going to be in contention. China, they're stacked. Australia, they've got a lot of mineral resources. And of course, the United States and Canada, we're going to be doing pretty well too. But for example, if we're going to do diamond mines, where's a lot of controversy regarding diamonds? It's these countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are exploited by diamond companies from the United States and Europe. So you think about geopolitically in our industry chapter here, why are people having such contention over Africa? Well, diamonds is one of those reasons. Situation factors. We've talked about site factors. Situation factors. This is the proximity to markets. The optimal location for your factory is close to its customers. You consider that in a bulk gaining industry, it makes something that gains bulk. So for example, if you had some sody pop, some soft drinks like Coke, Pepsi, and all that, you want that close to your markets because once you fill those bottles with liquid, they become a lot heavier. You don't want to transport them super long distances because that cost goes way up. That's why you'll find a lot of distribution centers with soft drinks close to major cities. Because they're a bulk gaining industry, meaning they add a lot of liquid to make their product. Things that you'll find with these bulk gaining industries are fabricated metals, beverage production, which I was just talking about, and single market manufacturers. This is where they specialize in one or two customers. For example, YKK Zippers, it has factories in 6 to 8 countries, factories in 68 countries to be near its customers. Also, auto parts manufacturers, they're very close to their customers because you're going to always need lots of auto parts. It's expensive to ship them across the country. So if you're making them in major cities, you can just get your customers whatever they want very quickly right there within the city. YKK Zippers, this is a standout in our book because they specialize in making zippers very fast, very quickly for the specific jobs that they need to make them for. And that's why they're in so many countries because so many clothing industries depend on them. And then, of course, perishable products. You want them close to the market. That is a situation factor. Fabricated metals, what we mean by this is, it's metals that you're putting together. If you have metal in its raw form, that's one thing. But if you fabricate metals together, that's a bulky, weighted process, and you want that close to the market so you don't have to transport it long distance. When you're shipping your stuff, there's different types of transportation. The thought is you want to watch out for these break of bulk points. This is where a transportation mode is exchanged. You want to minimize that as much as possible because whenever you have a break of bulk point, you're taking time because you're transferring it from like a ship to a plane. You're taking human power, because you have people that are running the machines to move the equipment from the ship to the plane. And it's just best if you can ship it all by one thing. That way you're getting it there quickly and efficiently. You're not having to change it out. Modes of transportation, you have trucks. Like think of the United States. They're quick. They can access any road. They can go any direction day or night. Trains, they can haul a lot of stuff. Long hauls, it's cheap and there's no brakes needed. It just keeps going. For example, trucks, you do have to have brakes. I'm not sure what it is. I think it's every 8 hours for your drivers, something like that, but they can't drive 10 hours. So if you're trying to ship something really quickly across country, it's going to be a little bit more expensive. Whereas trains, you can haul it a long way, no brakes, but then you still have to have a truck guy pick it up at the train station, or truck person. Ships, they're very low cost comparatively, but of course it's very slow going all the way across the ocean. Air, it's really fast, but it's really expensive. If you have something really heavy, it's going to cost you a lot. When we change the situation factors in key industries, well, copper. You got copper mines, you got them concentrated, then they also smelt and refine it. Steel in Pennsylvania, which is over here, it used to be really big there, but it moved west because they found it was easier to access the Great Lakes. They had a lot more efficient processing there, and they had a much more malleable workforce because they weren't as ingrained in the Pennsylvania steel unions here, and that's why it moved west. And then motor vehicles. You think about where are these things being created. First it's in North America, and then we start to see Europe coming up, and of course now East Asia is a big creator of motor vehicles in these markets here. So we're looking at steel production. In 1980, who's number one in steel? North America, because we're getting a lot of our steel. We have the industry, we've got the great labor force. Fast forward 30 years, 2010, where's our steel mainly being created in? China. They've got the resources, they've got the super cheap labor force, and they've got the means to transport it really quickly and efficiently. Assembly plants. So we're looking at cars. The big dots here, we're looking at 750,000 cars in 2011. Germany, of course, we're seeing lots of cars here. Which two do you think of first? Germany? That's right. BMW and Mercedes. So of course, we're getting lots of cars centered around Germany and this European country right here. Assembly plants. Look at everything we got going on in East Asia here with China, South Korea, and Japan. Lots of industry happening all over China because you've got port cities, lots of minerals and resources, cheap labor, and you can ship it out as quickly as possible. Japan, high-tech industry areas all along its coastline. South Korea is in there as well. Site factors. You got three you got to depend on here. Labor, capital, and land. Where you're going to put your factory depends on these three things. You can't put your factory where workers cost a whole lot of money and the land's expensive. That's just not very beneficial to you. So you're going to look at these three things. Where your factory's going to be located? Well, where you can have the cost of workers pretty low. That tends to not be so much in the United States anymore. It tends to be in Latin America or even India, China, parts of Asia. Capital. If you can put your factory in India, where the country of India will back you with some capital, with some money, so they can have income for their citizens, as opposed to putting it in the expensive United States, where do you think you're going to put it? Probably in India because it's cheaper. And then land. Land is expensive. If you put it around a major city, it's going to be very expensive. So nowadays, people look at locating it even in remote areas of the United States, or even somewhere where it's going to be cheaper in Asia. So here's our hourly wages. If you're looking at where you're going to build a new factory and you want to support the United States, here's an issue for you potentially. It's very expensive to pay every worker $30 an hour if they're working in your factory as a trained factory worker. You know, if we're just going by profits, it'd be much cheaper to have our factory located in China and India where people are working for close to $1 an hour. Everything in developed countries is going to be very expensive. Everything in up and coming or developing countries is going to save you a lot of money. I'm not saying you should go that way. I'm just saying it's the way it is right now. So textiles and apparel, changing inputs. So spinning is primarily done by low-wage workers in China. Whenever you're putting fabric together, China's the place to get it done because it's low-wage workers. Weaving, again, low-wage workers in China and India. And then sewing starts to be a little bit more technical, but you see a larger amount in the United States since most consumers are in developed countries. So we're still going to see the bulk of the textile clothing industry these days being done overseas in China, India. But you move over to specialized clothing items like blouses, you are going to see a lot of sewing still being done in the United States. Brazil, of course, one of the BRIC countries, big time in the textile production. And that's our look at Chapter 11, Key Issue 2. Hello and welcome to Chapter 11, Key Issue 3, where we're taking a look at where does industry cause pollution. Now, as we're getting started here, I just want to tell you that this is straight up from the textbook. These are not things that I personally believe. I'm just getting you the information from the text, if that makes any sense. Okay, so global scale air pollution. Rubenstein says that industry is the major polluter of air. If we look at this picture right here, this could be steam, but maybe it's smoke from burning particles. That would make sense according to this picture, the information. As country per capita income increases, per capita carbon dioxide also increases, meaning the more stuff you got as a developed country, the more it seems that carbon dioxide increases. The world's richest countries have the highest pollution levels. Again, this is from the textbook, not from me personally. Global warming, or the greenhouse effect. The United Nations states that carbon dioxide is up 25% in the last 200 years. Global scale ozone damage. The stratosphere, this is the layer of our atmosphere that absorbs dangerous UV rays from the sun. It is threatened by chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. Like back when I was a kid, which is a long time ago, they had this thing called Freon, what was a big damager of the stratosphere, of the ozone layer. And so they made us get rid of all of our products that had Freon in it. Developed countries are supposed to stop using it by 2020, and I think for the United States, we've pretty much gotten rid of those. And developing countries are supposed to stop using it by 2030. The reason why they give developing countries more time is that it is cheaper to use things like chlorofluorocarbons, and they don't want to damage their economy on their way towards being green. Regional and local scale air pollution. You've got things like acid rain happening. Acid rain comes from factories and it damages plants, kills animals, corrodes buildings and vehicles. These effects are not necessarily felt at the location, for example, where these factories are. Maybe you don't really feel those damaging effects because it gets into the weather patterns and it's dropped maybe somewhere else because it travels with the weather. Some things that will create acid rain will be carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, and the particulate matters that are in the air after you're burning something. And you think about it, a lot of times we think about, well, it's a nice campfire or they're burning wood. But when it comes to industry, the things that they're burning are very toxic and dangerous because a lot of times you're burning plastics or fabrics, which have lots of chemicals in them. And when it's burned, it creates lots of dangerous things in the air. Solid waste pollution. Supposedly we're looking at 4 pounds of solid waste per person per day. That's a ton. That's a lot of waste. Where's it all going to go? 60% of it is from residences where people live, and 40% is from business. If you think about it, everything we buy in the United States comes in a package. Even if it's just like a couple pens that you buy from the store, think about the huge cardboard and plastic packaging that it comes in. That's a lot of waste. So we have what's called sanitary landfills. This is the most common form of disposal. You're looking at trucks dumping off their waste right here from around the city. That's an idea, but the problem is it becomes a shortage of space because you have huge cities and lots of people every single day using 4 pounds of waste. Where are you going to put all that? So one of the things to do is incinerate it or burn it, and that reduces the bulk. And burning the trash can create energy, but one of the problems is the smell, and the other thing is possibly it getting into the air as it's being burned. Hazardous waste. These are byproducts of industry, things like mercury, cadmium, zinc, cyanide, solvents, and acids. As industries creating their products, they have a lot of dangerous and toxic byproducts. The EPA claims that 3.98 billion pounds of toxic chemicals are released into the air, I guess per year. I guess I didn't write that down and I apologize, but it's a whole bunch in 2010. EPA claims that mining is the largest polluter. So when you're mining, you're getting rid of tons of toxic substances. Ohio, the state of Ohio, had 10 of the 100 largest polluting firms. They're doing a lot of mining in Ohio. And if you look over here, this is really interesting. If you're more towards the East Coast, there's going to be a lot more areas where they have toxic waste chemicals, where they're releasing it. If you move towards the West, it seems to be a lot less, but look at these huge depositories of all these toxic waste centers. Like you really don't want to be in southern Arizona over here, or northern Nevada. Water pollution. You got two kinds. You got point source pollution, where it's being polluted right there at the source. For example, water manufacturers, where you've got wastewater from food washing and manufacturing. If you're creating some process and you need to use water to wash out your product, all those chemicals and waste are going into the water and then you're depositing it somewhere. A lot of times it's right there around your plant. Municipal sewage. More developed countries treat their water, but many less developed countries don't. They just have like their sewers with human waste going right into the water. And that's horribly dangerous and toxic. So that's point source pollution, where it's being polluted right there at the source. And then non-point source pollution. For example, if you've got a farmer that's laying down pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides on their grass, whenever it rains, that water is filtering out through the grass, picking up those particles, pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides, and it's going into the lakes, rivers, and streams. And it's the end of the day, so I can't talk. I'm sorry. And it destroys aquatic life. So it's not necessarily like they're dumping all these toxins into the river, but they are inadvertently putting it on grasses and crops and stuff. And in a non-source point pollution way, it's getting into the waters. The impact of water pollution of aquatic life. Your biochemical oxygen demand. This is the waste that uses all the oxygen. So if you've got a high demand on the oxygen in the waters because it's being used up by the toxins as they're breaking down, then other forms of life are not going to be able to live there. Like you see this pelican over here, obviously he's covered in some kind of substance that's terrible. But even if the water appears clean and you have fish living there that have a biochemical oxygen demand, but they need oxygen in the water, and you've got toxins in there that are breaking down and using the oxygen, the fish are going to die because they don't have the oxygen in the water. And then water that's heated, that also does damage to the life in the water, because a lot of times you'll have manufacturing plants and they'll have exhaust ports, or they'll have pipes running through the water to cool it down, and that over time heats up all the waters. Fish can't live at a higher temperature, and so they're going to die. And that's a look at chapter 11, key issue 3, our situation and side factors changing. So industry has shifted in the United States. Historically, it began on the East Coast with like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, even as far as Detroit and Chicago. Historically, in the South, you've got the Civil War that devastated the entire region. It really lacked infrastructure and economy. So the government comes up with policies to encourage growth down in the South by setting up tax incentives and lowering taxes against businesses and increasing some of the infrastructure over time. Well, something else that really helps that you just don't think about is air conditioning. So air conditioning comes around in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and that really opens up the South, because if it's in July in the summer in the South, you just can't have people working inside a hot building with machines because they're going to die. But with air conditioning, the South becomes a whole new area of industry because land is cheaper and of course labor is a lot cheaper. So one area to think about is the Gulf Coast, which is now huge with industry because of oil and gas. One of the things to consider is in the South, they have right to work laws. It sounds really good. Like, you have the right to work. Yes. And that's true. Like, you can go get any job you want. You don't have to be part of a union. The other part of that is if you are a worker and you think that your working conditions are unsafe, or if you're not making enough money, you're kind of on your own. Like, you can't really get people together to unionize and fight against your employer because, for example, Texas is a right to work state. Therefore, you're really at the mercy of your employers, the people who are paying you. So there's good and bad to that right to work situation. For example, we have a teachers union in Texas, which you might think could help us have a say about our wages and time off and working conditions, but it really doesn't, because Texas is a right to work state. Pretty much the union here is like, oh, you guys have an issue? Okay, thank you. We'll listen to you, and there's not really much we can do. Industry in Europe, how it's shifted. Same thing has happened in Europe, where you've got it moving from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. Why? Well, because you've got cheap land, low income labor, and the EU also encourages the support of these convergence regions, these lower economic status, lower industry infrastructure regions that need to be rebuilt and need to be supported. This is why you've got situations happening like Brexit, where Great Britain left the United Kingdom where Great Britain left the European Union because one of the things is they were tired of using their tax base, their citizens' money, to support economically these regions over here. They're not doing so well. People didn't want to pay taxes in the United Kingdom and not have their money stay here. They're tired of it, going here. So these convergence regions are being supported by the economy of Western Europe. One of the interesting places is Spain. And in Spain, it's seen the largest growth of industry, specifically in cars. And you think about it, well, what cars come from Spain? Can you name any? And I've had my students saying like, Fiat, like, no, that's Italy. Ferrari, no, that's Italy. And they really can't think of any cars from Spain. I mean, there are some like Opel, I think. But the cars being produced in Spain are Ford, Volkswagen, Nissan. You know, you think about, well, that's from Germany and Japan and the United States. Well, that's true. But due to everything we've been talking about in this chapter, like outsourcing and the new international division of labor, if you've got a car company and you can get cheaper labor and support in Spain and it's close to European markets, you're going to set your car company up here. And that's what Ford and Volkswagen and Nissan have done. So you're seeing these cars produced or assembled in Spain in this growing industrial market. Emerging industrial regions. Think of a company that's got vertical integration, where everything is in one place, all controlled by one company. And the example that comes up in our class is Tyson Chicken or Food Industries. So Tyson controls the market vertically, where when a chicken is born, it's controlled by a subsidiary of Tyson. So that when that chicken's born and all the way up through it being processed as food and going into packaging, which is gross to think about, but going into packaging and being placed on a grocery store or in a fast food chain, Tyson controls so much of that process. It is vertically integrated. New international division of labor is different from that. It's where high skilled jobs kind of are maintained in the developed countries, the low skill is outsourced. And that's everything we've been talking about. For example, if you need your cars created close to the European market for low cost labor, you're going to do that in Spain. Think about it. In the United States, if you've got a lot of manufacturing and textiles that need to be done, you're going to send that to the maquiladoras on the border of Mexico and the United States because it's cheaper labor. But you're going to maintain your management team probably in the United States. Outsourcing is the name of the game nowadays. I joke around that I have a film company, which I do, but it makes independent, low-cost films. And I joke that, well, for my next phase of production, I'm going to hire actors from China because I can get them at low cost. And even though they can't speak English, I'm going to dub over their voices. And I need textiles and dancers from India because they have a great Bollywood production industry down there. But I can get that cheaper than I can pay unionized actors in the United States. So that's kind of a fun way of thinking about outsourcing. Like if I wanted to pay U.S. union film crews, it would cost me so much money and actors as well. But I could outsource it and get it done for a lot cheaper. Mexico and NAFTA. The question I always ask is NAFTA good or bad? And people answer both ways. We're talking about the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is an agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States that eliminates trade barriers, and it's good because it allows for the free movement of goods and services. It does create some jobs in places like Mexico where they don't have the economy to support the new industry and infrastructure. But at the same time, think of Wallerstein's world systems theory where all of the profit is going back to core countries. Like there's the promise of jobs to places like Mexico, but really what we're doing is we're paying them super low wages. We're taking away from their own home market, and we are returning the profits back to the United States. And that's what's going on with NAFTA. These maquiladoras, these plants that are right near the U.S. border in Mexico, they use low-wage Mexican labor, poor working conditions. The problem is Mexico is now even losing out to cheaper labor in China and India. So Mexico's losing these jobs. So we open these new plants or newer plants in Mexico, these maquiladoras, and now we're shipping them off to India and China. So NAFTA is not even solving that issue. BRICS. These are countries. This is an organization of countries. You think about what is the most influential group of countries right now? Well, it's the G8. When you think of countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, the BRICS countries, I wouldn't say below, but they're the up-and-coming influential countries because of the things that they have. Countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These BRICS countries, they control 1/4 of the land area. That's huge. They have 3 billion people. Think about that as far as a workforce or as a military force. And they have 1/6 of the world GDP buying power. When these BRICS countries start to talk, people listen nowadays because if they're not on top, they are very quickly up and coming. Think about the industry. Where's the largest market? Well, China will be the world's largest economy in 2020. As the printing of this book was in 2011, a lot of people say that China is the largest market right now. So China is a major power player as far as industry. India will be second in 2030. And together, China and India, these are the largest labor forces. When these people want to make something happen, combined with Russia and Brazil, who are rich in inputs, they're going to be able to change the world. And in fact, that started to happen when you think about industry and where you want to create your products for. I am a filmmaker. I'm a teacher and filmmaker. One of the places I went to this fall was the American film market, where you put your films up for companies to see if they want to distribute it. And one of the major topics that came up was not, certainly still selling your film in the United States, but you know where the big country to sell your film is now? China. Because they are the largest market and they've got the biggest buying power, and tied in with these other countries, they've got a huge voice as far as industry. So all these things are definitely things to consider. Renew traditional industrial regions. So we want to return some of our industrial power to, say, the United States. We can no longer depend on forest production, where we just have mass production, not much skill needed, people doing the same task over and over and over and over, because we know that's been outsourced to Mexico and even China and India. So what we're trying to incorporate now is more of the post-forest production, where you've got teams of people who have some skill. They utilize problem solving, and they level out the playing field to where it's not just like managers control and own everything and get all the profits, but there's more sharing of productivity and the profits. Something else that helps for returning industrial regions back to like developed countries is just-in-time delivery. For example, if one of your major markets is the East Coast of the United States, you might want to set up your factory right there, your industry right there by the market, where you can get your parts by the hour to companies that might need it. Consider in the last key issue when we talked about the YKK zipper company, how one of their strategies was to be really close to the market. So if you have a clothing manufacturer and they need a different kind of zipper, you can get it to them really quickly. This reduces money needed in inventory because you're making things right there next to your market. It saves money because you're still outsourcing it, but you're close to the market. The problems could be, if your market happens to be, or your factory happens to be in a developing country, you could still have to deal with labor unrest issues, traffic that's dealing with lack of infrastructure, and problems with nature in countries where they don't know how to handle it, supposedly like they would in developed countries. So what's an American car? If we're thinking about industry, what is an American car? Is that made in the US 100%? Nope, not anymore. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, when they're considering emissions, they label the car as made in the USA if 75% of it comes from North America. Well, that's not too bad, so 75%. But then look at how they issue tariffs. The U.S. Department of Treasury considers 50% of a car as made in America if it's from the U.S. or Canada. So if a car is built 50% in the U.S. or Canada, that's made in the USA. That seems like a Is the glass half full or is it half empty? Because like that doesn't seem like it's completely made in the USA, but that's what they consider it. The American Automobile Labeling Act considers 85% of parts from that car, if they're from the US or Canada, then that is a US car. And then if your parts are 70% assembled and made in the United States or Canada, that is a domestic or US vehicle. So what is an American car? Well, less and less because of outsourcing and the new International Division of Labor. Is it made in the USA? Of course, look at the Prius, where it's about 10 to 20% assembled in the US and 10 to 20% parts from the US. That makes sense, right? Yeah, it's a little bit assembled and made here. The Ford Fusion, however, is kind of surprising, where it's got about 20% assembled in the US and maybe 50% parts from the United States. The Ford Fusion isn't really a US car because it's assembled other places. We just talked about it being assembled in Spain. Go all the way over here, we've got an American car, looks like for sure, right? The 100% assembled and 100% parts in the United States. But interestingly, the BMW, it's like 90% assembled in the United States. It doesn't have very many parts coming from the US, but BMW is assembled, this X3 is assembled primarily in the United States. So is that an American car? Because it's from a British company. Interesting. That's key issue 4. We've completed chapter 11. I'll see you in chapter 12. Hello and welcome to Chapter 12, Key Issue 1, where we're taking a look at where are services distributed. Listen, if you're getting these recordings in the spring of 2017, you've had to wait for Chapter 12, I apologize to you. I've had a whole bunch going on, and you guys are my highest priority because I love to make these videos, because I know they help all of us understand the material more. So sorry about the delay. Let's jump in here on Chapter 12, Key Issue 1. There's 3 types of services. We're talking about services. These are the things that you create for customers. Services generate more than 2/3 the GDP, the gross domestic product, in most developed countries, compared to less than 1/2 in most developing countries. What we're saying is, if you're talking about services, and you're in a developed country, you're doing things like accounting, legal, back office duties, things that people aren't going to be like on their hands and knees doing manufacturing or farming and all that. In developing countries, they're still working on jobs. They're still working on getting money from farming and maybe manufacturing industry. Services were in developed countries. The distribution of service workers is opposite that of the percentage of primary workers. So where you're finding these services are in the developed countries. Look at that. Western Europe, North America, Australia, where you have highly developed countries. Consumer services do provide services to individual customers who desire them and can afford to pay for them. Nearly 1/2 of all jobs in the US are customer services. This is where you are creating things for people to purchase, for people to consume. We're talking about retail and wholesale, education, health and social services, and leisure and hospitality. Now, just to start off the bat, when we're talking about education, we're not talking about public school teachers. That's public school teachers are funded within the public services. These are more like private schools where you're choosing to purchase these educational services. Retail and wholesale, these are department stores, grocery stores, motor vehicle sales, and wholesalers that produce merchandise to retails. Health and social services, we're talking about hospitals, healthcare, doctors' offices, nursing homes, and social assistance. And leisure and hospitality, we use those all the time, right? In the developed world, we go to restaurants, bars, lodging, arts and entertainment. I mean, you guys, if you're in high school, better not be going to bars, right? Thank you. But you can see the huge amount that's devoted to retail and wholesale. We're buying stuff all the time. People make their living off of creating items for people to purchase. Healthcare industry is also huge as well. Think about all of the hospitals, doctors' offices, nursing homes. These are consumer services that people have the option to purchase. Business services, to facilitate the activities of the businesses. 1/4 of all the jobs in the United States are within business services. We're talking about things like professional services, law, management, accounting, architecture, engineering, design, consulting, clerical, secretarial, and custodial. And financial services. We've got finance, insurance, real estate, or fire. This is the term that's called, hey, do you work in fire? No, I'm not a firefighter anymore. I used to be. Actually, that's true. I used to be a firefighter. But that's the term for finance, insurance, real estate. These are these financial services, fire. Or the transportation or information services, where you're transporting goods and services or people, trucking, warehousing, publishing, broadcasting, water, and electricity. These are things that you're having to purchase as part of a business structure. Public services, to provide security protection for citizens and businesses. So when we say excluding educators, 1/6 work for the federal government. That doesn't mean that educators are excluded from the public sector. And this is kind of confusing in your textbook. So when we say public services, it does include educators. But what this factor is saying, 1/6 of the people working for public services are in the federal government, 1/4 for the state government, and 3/5 for local government. So there's a huge chunk that is set up in local governments. And that does include public school educators. It's just the only reason they said this is because this fact doesn't include those numbers. But public services, we're talking about police officers. We're talking about firefighters. Rising and falling service employment. The service sector has shown the most growth, but it's also been hit the hardest since the recession in 2008. And if you're reading Rubenstein's textbook from 2011, 2008 was relatively recent after the 2008 recession. We know that lots of people were affected because of that housing crash, that housing bubble that burst. The changes in the number of employees, growth has occurred in the services where primary and secondary activities has declined. So if we're in a developed country, we're not going to see a lot of growth in primary and secondary sectors like in agriculture or mining. We're going to see a lot of growth in the tertiary and quaternary sectors where people are getting jobs in accounting and law and business and all that. Services in the recession. The service sector has been the engine of growth for developed countries, even as industry and agriculture have declined. But the service sector triggered the recession. Again, if you're in a developed country, services are going to fuel your economy. Our farming and the primary and secondary sector is going to decline because we're not doing those things so much anymore in the developed countries. Recession, it was caused by the service sector because there was a housing market bubble, the housing market crash, but it still fuels the economy for developed countries. And that's our quick look at chapter 12, key issue 1. Yeah, that's all there is. Welcome to chapter 12, key issue 2, where we're taking a look at where are consumer services distributed. Consumer services, they have a regular pattern. People are only going to drive a certain distance to go buy something. So we're looking at this graph right here, or this chloroplet, this colored diagram here from our textbook, Rubenstein chapter 11th edition. And for example, if we live in Dallas, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex here, this is the area that's serviced by things within that city center. So for example, if people are going to go watch the Dallas Cowboys, then they're going to travel a certain distance. This is the range, market area, threshold, all that stuff, right? If people are in Chicago and they want to go to get a Chicago deep dish pizza, here's their consumer services area, this blue right here. Why is there a huge amount of blue in Arizona? Well, because there's not very many settlements. There's not a lot of services offered. So if you've got a city up in this region, it's going to incorporate a lot of the state because there's not very many huge cities. So larger settlements offer more consumer services. Central place theory is a way of looking at these services. Selecting the right location for a new shop is the single most important factor when considering profitability. If you want to make money, you better make sure your shop's in the right place. So central place theory can help you do that. It helps to explain the most profitable location can be identified, and it was proposed by Walter Kristaller from Germany in the 1930s. When we're setting up our new Domino's pizza, per se, we're going to take a look at the market area. It's the area surrounding a service from which customers are attracted. So if we put our Domino's pizza right here, we're going to take a look at our market area. It's the surrounding area. Do we have the kind of people that are going to be able to afford and want to buy a Domino's pizza? Range. The maximum distance people are willing to travel. Well, if we have a Domino's pizza right there, and we know there's already 3 Domino's pizzas existing in the area, how far are people going to travel? If people live right here, if there's this huge new apartment complex going in, are they going to go to our Domino's pizza? Probably not. They're probably going to go to the closer one. So we want to make sure that there's a new settlement or new housing development going in to our Domino's pizza range. And then threshold. This is the minimum number of people needed to support the service. We can't just throw up a Domino's anywhere. We have to have the appropriate number of people to support that Domino's. We got to have the right threshold. Maybe everybody can afford and purchase a Domino's, so that might be likely to go in. Now, what if we had a really high dollar sushi place? Well, if we don't have the threshold of people to support that sushi place who are willing to pay $50 per person, that's probably not going to work. So we want to make sure that we put our sushi place probably in a city center where the people have the money to be able to afford that service. And down here, we're just looking at the same kind of thing. How far people are going to travel, the market area is everything here. The threshold is how many people and what type are going to be able to support our service. The hierarchy of consumer services. We're going to go to the nearest place. We're willing to travel great distances if the price is lower or if the item is unavailable locally. For example, let's say we are in Dallas area, and we live in this area right here. Now, if it's a regular weeknight and we don't feel like cooking, we're going to be willing to maybe drive over to the Domino's and pick up a quick pizza, right? We'll go there because it's cheap, quick, and easy. But we're not going to drive all the way to the city center probably on a weeknight. However, if it's our 20-year anniversary, which is coming up for me, even though I'm super young at heart, but I'm 41 years old when I'm making this video. Me and my wife are about to be married for 20 years in August. I don't know how we made it because she has to put up with me. But we're probably going to travel a farther distance, go all the way to the city center and go to the high dollar sushi place that she loves, which for us is Kenichi in Dallas. So you can see that this consumer service has the ability to pull from a lot farther distance. You're not going to have a Kenichi, a high dollar sushi place here in the suburbs where we live because it's not going to be supported because it doesn't have as many people or the type of people that can afford it. Market areas are arranged in a regular pattern. Larger market areas are fewer in number and farther apart from each other than a smaller market area. However, larger settlements provide goods and services with a smaller market area. So larger settlements have both larger and smaller market areas drawn around them. It's just like I'm saying, this Domino's pizza, it's going to have a smaller market area and it's going to be taken care of by the threshold, the range of people here. Domino's is not going to draw people all the way to the city center, all right? But a high dollar sushi place might, or a high dollar merchandise place like I don't know, what do you kids get these days? Like Prada, Gucci, yeah, Gucci. Hey, Brock, what do kids go buy these days? What high dollar things? When you drive downtown or whatever to purchase? Quickly now.
Drive down to the purchase.
What's a high dollar something you guys would buy?
Freaking shoes.
Okay, some kind of shoes.
Nike, yeah, we got the Nike outlet.
You go to the Nike outlet. Okay, so the Nike outlet is there. You go in Allen. It's going to be a consumer service that you're going to drive a long distance for. There you go. Rank size distribution settlements. This is how we just simply rank settlements from largest to smallest, and it creates a pattern. If we look at countries utilizing the rank size rule, we'll see that the country's nth largest settlement is 1/nth the population of the largest settlement. To make that all simple without using n's and ones over n's and all that, it's just like what? Basically, the population decreases in a consistent line. Example: United States of America. So if you go to our most populated city, New York, the next city down is going to be close to half, more than half of that. Okay, it's not half, but it's going to be down in a consistent manner from there. So we go L.A. So we go like New York, L.A., Chicago, and I don't know what falls from there, but let's just say Atlanta, Dallas, something like that. All right, it goes down in a linear type of pattern. That is opposed to, that's different from the primate city rule, where the largest settlement has more than twice as many people as the second ranking settlement. For example, what's the largest city in France? We all know it's Paris. What's the second largest city in France? You don't know. Maybe like one person knows. Okay, but we just don't know. France is the primate city. What's the second largest city?
Wait. What's the first letter?
L. I'll just move forward faster here. It's Lyon, okay? But the only reason we know that is because we looked it up in class. But primate city rule, okay, it's not talking about, you have monkeys in here ruling you. It's not whatever that end of the world movie is. No, primate city rule meaning it's the primary city in the country. Think about Mexico City. Mexico is by far the largest city. What's the second largest city in Mexico? No idea. Okay, that's different than rank size rule. Rank size rule is like you have a bunch of cities that are pretty populated, but they go down in ranking order like New York, LA, Chicago, and it makes a straight line. Primate city is like there's a populated city up here, Paris, France, and then the next city down is not even half as much. Okay? Market area analysis. Geographers apply central place theory to create market area studies that assist service providers with opening and expanding their facilities. Basically, people don't just open new stores because they're like, hey, cool, I think there's enough people here, let's open a store. They really use geography to analyze it. And the main factor is proximity to customers, and that is critical. If you're not close to customers, you're going to lose money. Profitability, we know we look at range, threshold, and market area. Range, how far people travel. Threshold, how many people will go. Market area, who is in your market area. In Texas, we have McDonald's and we have Whataburger. Okay? McDonald's is pretty much on every few blocks. It's affordable, but let's be honest here. Besides the French fries, their burgers, most people won't travel long distance for. They just go because it's convenient. Maybe they'll grab some French fries, whatever. Whataburger is a fast food restaurant too. But what people I think understand about Whataburger is it's a little bit more quality, a little bit more expensive. It tastes really good. You get bigger patties. So I think people will be willing to drive a little bit farther. So there's different range, threshold, and market areas for these two. The threshold for a Whataburger is going to be higher than the threshold for a McDonald's. You can put a McDonald's in any little country town. Whataburger has to have more people who are willing to buy that. The gravity model. The closer the service is, the more pull it has. Just like gravity, as they say, the theory of gravity. The more people, the more potential. As people get farther, they're less likely to use that service. if you have a Nike outlet in your city, you're going to travel. It has a lot of gravity to it for kids these days, right? You're going to travel a long distance to go to that Nike store. If you've got a Walmart, I mean, if it's in your town, okay, maybe you'll go, but there's probably another Walmart in the next town, so that doesn't have as much gravity. And then periodic markets. These are markets that are there for a short period of time. They don't exist all the time. This is a collection of individual vendors who come together to offer a good and service in a location on specific days. They provide goods and services to residents of developing countries and rural areas of developed countries where sparse populations and low incomes produce purchasing power too low to support full-time retailing. What we're saying is, periodic markets exist because people can't afford to go in and put a Walmart up. If you're in a developing country and you put a Walmart up, it's going to fail. For the most part, because the people there cannot afford to go into a Walmart and buy stuff. If you put a Walmart in, you have to have a huge building, a lot of concrete, huge parking lot, air conditioning. You got to pay all these employees. You have to stock your shelves with millions of dollars. You have to pay overtime and dental and medical bills and all that. That's called overhead. All that overhead is way too expensive. So what's great about periodic markets in developing countries is you have a farmer who grows a little bit of extra corn. On the weekends, he goes and sets up his booth. Maybe it costs him nothing, maybe a few dollars. In a small market, he sells that extra corn, gets a little bit extra money, and then he goes home. And everybody supports each other instead of having to depend on the huge overhead of like a Walmart or Target or a grocery store. So periodic markets really help out developing countries. And that's our look at chapter 12, key issue 2. Welcome to chapter 12, key issue 3. We're taking a look at where our business service is distributed. In the hierarchy of business services, there are definitely cities that are more important as far as business services than others. The business services in global cities. When we talk about a global city, we're talking about cities that stand out. Huge cities that have real far reach importance because they're the centers of flow of information and capital, of money. They have law, banking, insurance, accounting, and advertising that extends beyond the country. They have the headquarters of large corporations. When we think about global cities, the 3 that come to mind are New York, London, Tokyo. These cities are ranked into 3 categories. All cities are ranked into 3 categories, alpha, beta, and gamma cities. To rank them, we look at economic factors. What are the number of headquarters for companies and finance and law that they have there? We look at political factors. Do they host international members or international organizations? We look at cultural factors. Is there renowned institutions in that city? Renowned media centers? And we look at infrastructural factors. Do they have a major international airport? Do they have major hospitals where people fly in from across the earth to get services, to get fixed at that hospital? Do they have advanced communication systems? And then as far as consumer and public services in global cities, if you're in a global city, your retail has an extensive market, but it also has more retailers, meaning we've got stores and kinds of perhaps clothing or furniture that people will travel all across the world because you're a global city and these things they have that far reach. But we also have more people, more retailers. It's not just one clothing store, it's thousands. Global cities are loaded with plays, concerts, sports, nightclubs, restaurants. So we think about Dallas, because that's where we live. Is it a global city? In one sense, yeah. But we look over here and see that it's an alpha minus. So we're at the top of the cities that have international reach. But we don't have as much as New York City. We don't have as many people. We don't have as many headquarters of major corporations. We don't host like the United Nations. We have some renowned institutions. But really, if you're talking about institutions, museums, there's going to be so much more in New York City as compared to Dallas. Infrastructural factors. I think about our hospital, Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Sure, it has a renowned burn center. Like if you get burned, people from most of Texas, specifically North Texas, are going to go to Dallas. But more than that, New York has multiple hospitals that are renowned for their burn centers. So that's why New York is going to be ranked above. Here's a closer look. So the big ones, as I stated before, we got New York, London, Paris, Shanghai, and Tokyo. And even look, Singapore and Sydney, they're up close to the top there. Lesser cities, we're seeing Dallas where we live, LA, Chicago, Dubai, up and coming, big time. All right. When you need something done and you want to make connections, if you have offices in one of these major cities, you're going to be doing okay because you have connections and the availability for so many other services. That's the benefit of being in these global cities. Business services in developing countries. There's 2 that tend to stand out. Offshore financial services. Why would offshore financial services be big in developing countries? Well, because taxes are very low in those countries, and you're not taxed in the United States for the most part. And there's privacy, where your assets are protected, potentially. For example, the Cayman Islands has 40,000 people. We have so many towns in this country that have 40,000 people and way more. The Cayman Islands only has 40,000 people, but it has over $1 trillion in assets. What that means is there's people from the United States that have businesses or personal even, and then they store their money in the Cayman Islands because they're not taxed on it and their privacy is protected for the most part. So these offshore financial services you're going to find in developing countries. Why? Because of these 2 reasons right there. And then in developing countries, you're also going to see business process outsourcing or BPO. These are back office functions like processing, claims processing, payroll, transcription work, clerical, billing, and tech help. Think about it. When you call up for technical help these days, is it usually a person from the United States that answers the phone? No. Think about where it's from. A lot of times it's from India, because it's a lot more affordable over there because people are working for lower wages and they're being trained to speak English. So if you're running a business and you don't want to pay as much taxes in the United States, you want some of your assets protected. Like if you went bankrupt, you still had maybe a lot of money and assets over there in the Cayman Islands, and you could pay workers a lot less to do the same thing. You're probably going to think about setting up your business in a developing country. The economic base of settlements. You've got basic industries that export primarily to customers outside the settlement, and new basic industries that spark growth for new services. And you've got non-basic industries. These sell to customers who live in the same area, but do not spark new services. So if you've got, for your economic base in your city, some basic industries, you're going to be doing great because they're exporting to consumers outside the settlement. But because this is such a big company, then new industries are going to spark right around that. If you've got a non-basic industry, you're going to sell to customers in the same area, but it's not going to be big enough. Like for example, I'll use my Domino's service again, right? If you're Domino's and you show up in your settlement, you're going to sell to customers in the same area, but you're not going to create new services. But if you're like a basic industry, like a Nike distribution center, then you're going to export to consumers outside of that Nike distribution center, but you're also going to probably spark the new growth of services like, for example, a new Domino's, because you have to feed the people that are going to be working at that new distribution center. So what you're seeing these days for cities that aren't necessarily all the way at the top of the global city hierarchy, you're going to see specialization where a city focuses on a service. Now these are generalized, but you start to see if a city isn't a major global player, then perhaps it'll focus on something like entertainment. When you think of Las Vegas, Reno, and Atlantic City, you got Vegas that's focused on gambling, entertainment. They're not big on manufacturing. They're big on entertainment. Pretty much all Vegas is straight up entertainment, right? So they specialize that. That's where they get all their revenue. If you're looking for data processing, maybe you're looking at Boston or San Jose, California. High tech, maybe you're looking at Austin, Orlando, or Raleigh, Durham. Austin down here in Texas, known for high tech. They're not necessarily a big manufacturing or industry giant, but they specialize in the tech industry. So Austin makes a lot of revenue from that. Military support. If you're in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or Colorado Springs, you're going to be supporting the military with a lot of your business and consumer services. Medical, Rochester, Minnesota. All right, management consulting, Washington, D.C. If you're doing a lot of consulting, you're over here in Washington, D.C., along the eastern seaboard with all these major cities up here. And then we also consider the distribution of talent. Some cities have more. If you need talented people, where are you going to look? Are you going to look in Lubbock, Texas? Well, yeah, sure. There's some highly talented people there. But there tends to be a higher distribution of talented people in Los Angeles than like Lubbock. There tends to be a higher amount of talented people in Dallas. And what we're saying as far as talent is, okay, maybe we're talking about traditional talent like actors for the entertainment industry. Certainly, you're going to find those in Los Angeles. But we're also talking about physicians, key legal personnel. Anybody who's highly skilled in what they do, that's talent. Some cities have more. New York City is going to have more talent than Dallas is going to have. Unless you're talking about me, then Dallas has a lot of talent. Ha! Just kidding. Let's look at chapter 12, key issue 3. Welcome to chapter 12, key issue 4. We're taking a look at why do services cluster in settlements. Services in rural settlements out in the country. You usually find clustered rural settlements. You have an agricultural-based community in which a number of families live in close proximity with fields surrounding a collection of houses and farm buildings. You got people that live in small little communities out in the country. And it happens in 3 different types. The circular type. Perhaps they developed in a circle because you had animals or small perishable gardens in the center, and then the people had their dwellings that guarded everything in the center. Linear, along a line. Perhaps these things developed along a road or along a river, and all the houses were getting water and the farms were getting everything from the river. You also have clustered, where colonists traveled as a group. They put their center of religious belief, their church in the center, and they develop their town or their settlement right there all together. If you're coming all the way across the ocean to the New World, I'm sure you'd want to be around other people as well. These are clustered rural settlements. But you also have dispersed rural settlements where people are far apart from each other. Farmers live on individual farms isolated from neighbors. You find this a lot in North America. In the USA, if you traveled over the Appalachian Mountains, land was cheap. And therefore, your family's kind of already established maybe here in the United States back east. But as you move west, you grab a whole bunch of land, you put your farm in the middle, and no one's around you. That's happened in the United Kingdom because of the enclosure movement, where the government confiscated private lands and made them large individual lands, and so people started to move to cities. If you're in the United Kingdom and the government grabs a whole bunch of land and gives it to one person, everybody else is pretty much going to have to go live in the city because you're not going to have somewhere to work and live. And one person maybe controls a bunch of vast land, so it's going to be a lot more dispersed. In these early settlements, whether dispersed or clustered, you have services. You've got early consumer services. Maybe it was a place to bury the dead, or holy sites, where you would go and you buy the rights to a piece of land that you can bury your family member. Early public services. One of the first services was soldiers to protect the land. And then the early business service might have been warehouses to store food, warehouses to store supplies, so that one person's kind of having the business on that. And if you're a farmer or a traveler, you come in and you can still get those items. So here we have the dispersed rural settlement. And down here, we have a cave showing the evidence of an early settlement. Obviously, because look, it's a cave. Hello, it's evidence. It's a cave. I guess there was drawings and pots and stuff in there, maybe. Urbanization, where people start to move from their dispersed or clustered rural settlement into the cities, the process of urbanizing. We go all the way back to prehistoric urban settlements. We think about the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, which is now present-day Iraq. You have a city called Ur, and this is one of the perhaps earliest known settlements where people came together to support each other through public services, business services, consumer services for the first time, perhaps. Moving forward, we have ancient urban settlements, thinking of Troy, Athens, Greece, Rome, where you've got these city-states that are independent, self-governing communities that included the surrounding countryside. What's a city-state? Well, you've got, for example, Athens, it's a city, but it also governs the surrounding countryside. It's a city-state, and these become the trading centers for thousands in the Mediterranean area. Fast forward to medieval urban settlements. You've got the feudal system, a hierarchy of persons where residents are given rights in exchange for military service. If you have a house out here just outside the city walls, you're going to be given some protection by the soldiers in this castle here, but in exchange, whenever the king decides he's going to go invade another country, guess what? You're going to have to go work in that army. These largest cities served as power centers for lords and church leaders and as market centers. So it starts to be a lot more like what's going on today. We look at the largest settlements since 1 AD. Trying to go all the way back here. We're looking at earliest, of course, Rome in Italy. Fast forwarding, you start to see Constantinople over in what's current day Turkey. You see Xi'an over in China. And we don't study it a lot in our history in the United States in our educational system, but you've got huge urban centers and services developing in the places like China and on the eastern part of Asia. What are our largest settlements? Now you look at, Industrial Revolution by 1900, London's pretty big. Turn of the new millennium, turn of the century, you've got Tokyo, that's huge now, one of the largest settlements. Rapid growth of urban settlements. Urbanization, of course, is the process by which the population of urban settlements grow. If something is rapidly urbanizing, you're going to have a lot of services, but also a lot of issues that go along with it. The increasing percentage happens, and this is the percentage of people living in urban settlements. It reflects a country's level of development. The population of urban settlements exceeds rural settlements for the first time in 2008. So basically, we're saying in 2008, there's more people living in cities than there are living in the country. That happened for the first time in 2008. So you know the whole world is developing. This is up from 3% in 1800. In 1800, only 3% of the world's population was living in the cities. Fast forward 200 years to 2000, almost half of the population is living in cities. Another 8 years later, over half. Over half. That's how fast we are developing and urbanizing. It's not just this increasing percentage, though. It's also an increasing number. Developing countries have more very large urban settlements. 8 of 10 countries are developing. 8 of the 10 most populous cities are in developing countries. Cairo, Delhi, Jakarta, Manila, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Seoul, and Shanghai. Those are in developing countries. Think about that. In developing countries, a lot of the times, you'll have that one city or couple cities where people just move from the country straight to the city to find work, and those cities become huge. Think about Mexico City. It's a primate city. What's the second largest city in Mexico? I don't know, because Mexico is so huge. As opposed to the United States, where you've got New York City, but also other large cities like Chicago, LA, Miami, Dallas, Atlanta, and then, of course, Tokyo. So as numbers increase, it makes even more impact in the developing countries, because then here's their huge cities. Difference between urban and rural, between city and country. Well, it's the large size. Rural dwellers know many of their people in their community, and urban residents only know a small percentage. We're talking about large size. That's obviously the difference. If you live in the country, you're going to know probably a lot of people in your town. But let's say your town has 10,000 people. Are you going to know a whole bunch of people in New York City? No. So it's a much larger size. High density is the difference too. Each person in an urban setting specializes in a special role or performs a specific task. They have social groups that compete to occupy the same territory. If you're in a city, there's a whole bunch of other people kind of like you, right? So you're gonna have to specialize in something. So maybe you specialize in your form of art, like you're a ballerina dancer for a certain cultural group. You know, you have to be very specific to stand out in an urban setting because there's such high density. You can't just be a doctor. You're gonna have to specialize because there's so many other people. There's so many other doctors in New York City. You're gonna have to stand out some way. And there is social heterogeneity. The larger the settlement, the greater the variety of people. A person has greater freedom in an urban area to pursue an unusual profession, sexual orientation, or cultural interest. It's in a rural area where you would really stand out. So if you're in a small community and you want to pursue, let's just go with ballet dancing, okay? In a small community, you're really going to stand out as that one maybe ballet dancer. And it's going to be difficult for you to support yourself perhaps because there's not a lot of centers or other people doing ballet maybe in your town. Whereas if you go to New York City and you're a ballet, there's probably going to be a number of different areas where you can go and be a ballet dancer for a living, for money. And there's going to be other people like you so you don't stand out as much. So here's our urban settlements with a population of at least 2 million. And it stacks up quickly. Along the equator, look at how many cities there are, especially as we get into Asia. There's so many cities that have over 2 million people. Back over here, of course, we've got Dallas Fort Worth that does the major cities, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Looking at Mexico City, that is their one humongous city, but you have a couple that are up and coming. And that's our look at Chapter 12, Key Issue 4. That finishes us out. Look, if you are looking for Chapter 13, that is one of the first videos that I did. So sequentially, that may not come up right after this video. You may have to dig back into my channel and take a look for that one. But I really appreciate you guys. I hope these videos are helpful, and I'll see you in the next video. Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk about why do services cluster downtown as we examine Chapter 13, Key Issue 1. I'm your host, Andrew Patterson. So we look at the CBD, the Central Business District. This is just downtown city areas. You think of Dallas, Chicago, New York City, Baltimore. These are very compact but large percentage of public, business, and consumer services are located in these areas. So, of course, downtown is where you have tons of people, tons of businesses and services and automobiles. This, what you think of, is the Central Business District. Services locate there because of accessibility. That's where everything is. That's where all the people are. If you're going to be a service for, some lawyers, that's where you're going to need to locate. If you're going to be a restaurant, you're going to be there because there's people working down there. Everything is in the CBD. This is the easiest part of the city to reach because everything's located there and it's very central. It's a focal point of transportation because all hubs, all roads lead to the downtown portion of the city. Usually this is the oldest district, usually near the origin of the settlement where the town grew up from its old days into what has become a major city. And it's usually along a body of water or transportation route because there had to be a reason initially for that CBD to develop. There had to be a reason why that town developed there in the first place. So usually it's on a major thoroughfare like a road or what used to be a trailway for wagons or a railroad passing or on the water. So here's our look at Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. This is the Central Business District. We can see the various business services surrounding the city center park. We can see consumer services all embedded here, educational schools, some people, residential areas packed in there as well, and very limited parking here and there. But along this river in Pennsylvania, we've got the Central Business District where it's very dense and everything is packed in together. So public services in the Central Business District. We've got things like city hall, courts, state agencies, and libraries. These are all things that are funded publicly that are supposedly services that go out for all of the general public. We've also got places of worship like churches, temples, which historically grew as the town. Historically, they were planted there by founding members of the cities. Social service agencies, sports facilities. Like, here we used to have the Dallas Cowboys much closer to downtown. Now they're way out in Arlington. But other cities, like you think of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where you've got the Steelers downtown, you've got the Pittsburgh Pirates downtown. You think about Cleveland, where you have the Cleveland Indians, the baseball team, the Cleveland Cavaliers downtown. So traditionally, you've got activities and sports and places of worship and public agencies right there downtown. And they've built convention centers because they want to bring populations in there to take advantage of all the services that are downtown. This is a good way to raise money. This is a way they stimulate business for all the restaurants, bars, and hotels that are down there. Business services in the CBD. We've got advertising, banking, finance, journalism, and lawyers. They're located in proximity to those government offices and courts that we talked about previously in the public services. All that's downtown, well, then you're going to want to have business to support all of that. If you are a business or an office that supports the legal process, like if you're an office supply company, you're going to want to be right there where everything's going on. And the reason that makes it beneficial is you're still utilizing personal relationships for face-to-face meetings. We're going to go to lunch with people who are working downtown so that we can build a relationship and we can get them to use our office supply company. Business services, they're very accessible to a variety of neighborhoods for various workers. For example, we've got top executives that live right there in the CBD. We've got junior executives all the way on down to people who might be performing secretarial duties, even custodians. Everybody's packed in to the CBD. Consumer services in the CBD. We've got retailers with a high threshold, meaning we've got department stores that are able to support the needs of lots of people in this dense area. But we've also got retailers with a high range, meaning perhaps we've got specialty jewelry and clothing. Maybe we've got a Prada store downtown. People will drive a long way to come into the CBD because you're not going to have a Prada store on every corner. Like back in the suburbs, we generally don't have Prada, way far out from the CBD. We keep Prada in a central location in the CBD because we know they'll drive a long way to access that clothing and buy it probably. And then you've got other retailers who exist there strictly to support the downtown workers, like restaurants, office supply stores, computer tech working agencies. So if you have all these workers and you're a restaurant, it'd be great for you to be right there in the CBD because that's a bunch of people that are going to need to eat lunch. Things that we don't generally see in the central business district. Well, we've got a really high rent because there's not very much land because so many people and buildings and businesses and services are crammed in there. So we're going to see a lack of manufacturing in the central business district because manufacturing takes up a lot of space and we need a lot of cheap land to be able to make products affordably. So you're not going to see manufacturing. Larger ships that go along with manufacturing that used to be able to get into the harbors, well, now because things are so packed in and because our ships are being made bigger to carry more items, they can no longer fit into traditional harbors of the CBDs. And what we're really seeing as downtown is transferred from industry, creating things, to more commercial and more recreational. We're seeing much more parks and tourism that draws people downtown instead of workers to create products as far as industry is concerned. The other thing is we have a lack of residents. People traditionally moved into the CBD for jobs, like in the industry, but as industry moved out looking for cheaper land, people have done the same thing. People have been pulled to the suburbs because they can buy more land and they can live cheaper and they can send their kids to better schools. Because when you have populations crammed into the CBD, there's just too many people to support for the public system. So as they move away, they're buying, single family homes with land when they have to mow their own land, but there they are, and they're sending their kids to better schools. People are pushed out of the CBD because it's very high rent, very expensive, and you've got a lot of poverty and crime because as people traditionally moved into the CBD, they had work. Now that work is starting to move out of the CBD, or it has for some time, you've got people that can no longer afford jobs. The thing about it is, people who can't afford jobs that have residents in the CBD, it's difficult for them to move to the suburbs because how are they going to get there? Number one, they don't have a car. Number two, it's expensive to buy a house and live out in the suburbs. Because if you don't have a car, you can't really walk places in the suburbs. So you've got crime in the CBD because people have to find a way to live, so they're going to steal things. Perhaps they're going to sell and use drugs. We have seen some repopulation, but there's still low population in the CBDs because nowadays there's a lack of consumer services like grocery stores. Like you think about it in the suburbs, we've got maybe a Walmart or Target and things like that on every corner. But in the CBD, land is so competitive and so expensive, we're not seeing lots of grocery stores. So if you're not able to walk down the street and buy some food, it's going to make it difficult to live there. So we've got a lot of competition for land in the central business district. Because it's so intense, it pushes things vertically, meaning we're going to have to expand upward or down below ground. So underground, we see the utilization of spaces like garages, loading docks, lots of pipes. We send the sewage underground because above ground people are walking around and we build skyscrapers up, but below ground we've got to pack things in as much as we can. We've also got the subway underground and pedestrian passages where we cut tunnels for people to walk between buildings underneath the street, and we sell real estate above the street so we can pack in more businesses and services. Skyscrapers, these were made possible in the 1880s by the implementation of the elevator and by the creation of steel, which allowed for structures to stand taller and more strong without fear of bricks toppling over. We've got artificial lighting and air conditioning, which makes being inside buildings during the hot summer much more enjoyable. Retail pays very high rent for street space in this competition for land in the CBD. Because if you're a retailer, you want to be right there on the street so people can walk in and buy your stuff. So businesses, they're going to occupy traditionally more middle-level offices and skyscrapers because they're able to afford it. And then at the very top, we've got people who live on upper floors because there's less noise up there and you have great views. The problem we've got in the CBD is it's become kind of a food desert, meaning it's difficult to find healthy food. And if you look at Baltimore over here, all of these areas in the purple pink are food deserts, meaning there's nowhere to find food, or at least nowhere to find healthy food. Like perhaps maybe there's a McDonald's sitting on a corner here, but for the most part, there's nowhere to get healthy food. So if you're living in the middle of this area here in Baltimore, you're going to have to walk a long way or take a taxi, which is expensive, to find food. So the distance in Baltimore to the market is more than half a mile. And that's only one time around the track. But if you think about it, if you're busy and you're trying to work and you're trying to support your family by working 3 jobs, you don't have time for that. So income is well below the poverty level in these areas because we don't own cars and there's not healthy food. What we've got is not a literal desert where it's sand, but there's no food. You cannot purchase food in these areas. So that is a problem in the CBD areas. We've got these urban areas, these cities. Where are people going to be? Well, to do this, we're going to look at a few different models. The first one is the concentric zone model. Really, we've got rings that organize where people might live. And the innermost ring is the CBD. This really isn't a residential area. We've got businesses and services in the middle, in the center here, and this is the inner ring. Then from there, we've got the zone of transition, which is this purple ring, meaning we've got low-income housing, lots of industry, where perhaps what's going on in the central business district in the center is that industry has moved out because in the center of the city it's always very expensive. So just away from there as it grew, we've got industry and low income housing, which was able to set up because it was a little less expensive at that time. And it was close to the populations of the city at the beginning. Out from there, we've got the zone of the working class, where we've got older houses, stable workers. These are the people that were transitioning in to work in the factories and industry that were traditionally in this ring in before them. Outside of that, we've got the zone of better residences, where we've got newer, bigger houses. The land is becoming less expensive. These people are still commuting in to work in various rings within them, but as we get away, we've got cheaper land and more people are living in that zone of better residences. And then back from there is the commuter zone, where we've got small housing. And people are basically just able to afford their housing in this commuter zone, and they're still going all the way into the CBD or even to the industry of the inner ring. We've got the sector model, which is just a little bit different. It's the same general ideas, but basically we're looking at the city as it develops in sectors or wedges, not rings, as we move away from the center. So we've still got the CBD in the center of this place here, but as cities grow, our activities expand outward in wedges. So the concentric zone model, it's kind of utopian, right? Where we have everything that's in a circle and it's all perfect. Well, the wedge seems to make a little bit more sense. Where, for example, we've got the central business district, and then we've got transportation and industry that kind of moves outward from it in this wedge here. And back over to this side, we still want to have access in a close manner to the CBD, but we've got this high-class residential area that takes up this entire wedge here. Of course, they don't want to have to commute all the way in, so they are going to be close to the CBD, and it only makes sense that that would wedge out in that position. So I think the sector model seems to make a lot of sense. The multiple nuclei model, where we've got activities that evolve around many centers. If you look at urban areas, it's pretty common that a lot of times you don't just have one city center, but we've got many. And in this multiple nuclei model, where we see in this graphic here, we've got the city center here, we've got a little nuclei here, we've got another nuclei here. And what we look at is close to each is we've got the low-class residential on both sides here, and it's kind of hitting in the central business district, and it's hitting this nuclei here because this is fulfilling the jobs market for these people who are living in these areas. They can hit either of these places. And then, of course, we've got our higher class housing, which is outside, but they're supported by this industry and portion of this nuclei here. We take a look at the concentric zone of housing in Houston. So we're looking at rings. And if you look at the inner ring here, for the most part, we're looking at housing that's a lot older. It's below, it's below 10, meaning we didn't have very many houses in percentage-wise that were built since 2005. But as we move out, we see a ring here where we start to see a lot of red, even here and there. And it's not all the way around, but we start to see that when we examine the concentric zone, that as we move out, it only makes sense that as we're more away from the city and the origins, that people are building houses in these outer rings because that's the land that's left and that's the land that's more affordable. The sector model of housing in Houston, we're going to look at how expensive things are. And it's, as you can see, kind of in sectors now. That we look at the most expensive housing has the darkest green. So this sector here has got the most expensive housing. This wedge or this sector, you can see, comes all the way out from the central business district. So that makes sense. This is set up, or it's organized. It's observed using the sector model because the ring doesn't really go all the way around. It doesn't make complete sense, but we've got housing organized more in wedges. And then the multiple nuclei of race and ethnicity in Houston. You can see that it's kind of all over the place. So in Houston, we've got the nuclei of African Americans in the at least 60% range here, then up over here in this nuclei, and the same thing with Hispanics. We've got this nuclei over here, we've got this center over here, and back over in this region. Look at CBDs in Europe, and how are they different from what we know of in the United States? Well, they're less dominated by skyscrapers because they're restricted. And in fact, when you look at the Tour Montparnasse in Paris, this is Europe's tallest building, and what they decided was people really threw a fit because you had this beautiful traditional historic landscape down here, and then they built this tower, and the people were like, okay, that doesn't match the layout and the history and the beauty of our city. So they put restrictions on it in Europe. Whereas in the United States, we're unrestricted. You can build skyscrapers for the most part as tall as we want. So CBDs are going to look different because their skyscrapers are shorter. We've got more palaces and churches in Europe because they've had a lot more centuries and thousands of years of growth, where we had the traditions of kings and religious institutions that went back much farther than business districts that developed in the United States. Parks that you might find in the CBD, well, they used to actually be private residences. Like maybe it was part of the kingdom. Maybe it was part of like an earl or a duke or someone who owned lots of land in the area. The streets are narrow because people are used to walking and using horses instead of having semi-trucks and lots of multiple lane vehicles like we do in the United States. And more people live downtown in Europe. Traditionally, as cities developed in Europe, that's where everybody lived. And even before you had industry and manufacturing, people lived down there. So as the Industrial Revolution diffused in Europe, those institutions developed on more of the edge of the city because the city was already developed. In the United States, industry was what developed cities a lot of the time. So that's why you see industry traditionally in the cities in the United States as opposed to Europe. We try to apply models to these European cities. And let's see how that works out. Well, here's Paris, France. And we've got wealthy people that live in the inner circle as we examine the sector model here. So this is the only circle we're really seeing. But broken out into sectors here are people with incomes that are broken out into sectors. You definitely see this sector over here is the high income sector as it approaches the CBD of downtown Paris. Other sectors are more areas with less income, and it's definitely not in a concentric setup. But downtown, you're going to find the best shops, restaurants, cafes, and culture in the city center in Europe. You don't necessarily see that in the United States because that's where industry historically developed, and we didn't really see the best restaurants. Nowadays, those are moving out more towards the suburbs. In Europe, the difference is poor people live on the outskirts of the city because, again, historically, as cities developed in Europe, rich people lived in the city center because that's where you had all the centers of shops and restaurants and cafes. Poor people, as they moved to find jobs in, for example, Paris, they could not afford the housing in the city center, so they had to live on the outskirts. High-rise, space-saving structures, they're not going to be like the suburbs of the United States. So what they've done is, instead of creating this urban, suburban sprawl like we did in the United States, models of European cities, they create space-saving structures, meaning they don't want to take up a bunch of land. They create more apartments and high-rise type institutions so as to not sprawl out all the way across the landscape. And that's some of the differences in Europe as opposed to the United States. And then in developing countries, like you think about the Western Hemisphere, maybe in Latin America, and this is what we're looking at, the sector model for what people are seeing in Latin American cities, where you've got the central business district, and you've got wealthy people that push out from the center in this elite residential sector. Like again, it's not necessarily a full concentric zone, but we've got wealthy people that live together, and they're going to be more like in a wedge as we move away from the city center. We've got middle class that kind of tie off of the elite, and then around that, we're going to see going back into the CBD, this gentrification process where people are trying to move back in and make it a nicer area to live, whereas before it had been dilapidated and deteriorating. We look at sectors in Sao Paulo, Brazil. You can see there's not really any concentric zone. There's no circles that we're looking at. There's just a lot of sectors. So we're looking at the most expensive housing, the most expensive household income, who's making the most money, and we see those kind of peppered all over the place around the CBD. And again, just like in Europe, we're seeing the people who make the most money living downtown in the central business district. But here we do, I'm just looking straight at this, you can totally see concentric zones. We're a circle here in Paris. We're looking at houses that are built from 2000 to 2010, and where they started building all their housing. Well, the newer housing is going to be in the outer rings in the form of high-rise apartments for poor people. Because again, in European cities, where do the rich people live? People with the most money, downtown. And you don't see any new houses being built. What you see is people moving in, and one they can afford is in the outer ring here in the last 10 years. Squatter settlements. You can look downtown to the central business district over here. You can see the suburbs here. And then from that, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, we've got squatter settlements. These are people that cannot afford to live downtown. They're on the outskirts of the city, remember, which is different from downtown in the United States. In the US, people who are poor live downtown. In Europe, they cannot afford to live down there. This is where they're able to find housing and land. Well, what I say is housing, these shanties, these shacks. It's on the outskirts of the land. Stages of development. When we look at developing countries, first we had the pre-colonial cities, where it's mostly rural settlements. For example, we consider Latin America in Western Europe, but in some places you have cities like Tenochtitlan, which became Mexico City, and the node for all this activity was the religious Great Temple in the city of Tenochtitlan. So it wasn't like their central business district, but it's what it was. It was a temple, and this area became their central business district in Tenochtitlan. We then moved from its origins to where they were colonies of Europeans, and you really start to see the influence of that European city in the Latin American Western Hemisphere cities, because when the Europeans came in, they expanded the cities following standardized plans. And that's why so many South American cities have that very similar pattern, where you've got the gridiron, as you can see, it's totally all like straight roads, all patterned in there. You've got the church, you've got the central plaza, and you see that everywhere in Latin America. One of the reasons for this is because they had the Law of the Indies in 1573, where they outlined city planning, and they all pretty much had to follow that plan. But since then, since these Latin American cities have gotten away, they've gained their independence from European control, millions have migrated to the cities in search of work. What we see, especially in South America, is this huge uneven population distribution in large primate cities. Like in the United States, we have a lot of cities that have large populations, but we also have suburbs and other urban areas that are built up across the country. Well, that's different in South America and Latin cities, because what you've got is a huge city like Lima, Peru, which holds millions of people, because everyone goes there for work, and it doesn't necessarily sprawl out or diffuse or be balanced out across the entire country. Areas expanding. This is our look at chapter 13, key issue 3. Suburban expansion. We look at the peripheral model. We've got the inner city surrounded by a large suburban area. Here's our inner city, and then we got a large suburban area. This is our central business district and everything surrounding it in the concentric zone model, perhaps, sector model. But then we've also got all these suburbs living out here. This is Dallas, Texas. Then we've got like Coppell somewhere over here, perhaps. Why are the suburbs expanding? Well, we've got our urban area. These are some definitions that are going to help us define and explain that. The urban area, we've got a dense core. We have land in between, and then we have the dense suburb where millions of people live. Our urbanized area, we designate that by saying they have at least 50,000 inhabitants. So that's a significantly large area. Our urban cluster is between 2,500 and 50,000 inhabitants. MSA, our metropolitan statistical area. This measures the functional area of a city, which includes the urbanized area with a population of at least 50,000, the surrounding county that it's in, and adjacent counties with a high population density. So for example, if we're talking about Dallas, this is going to be our metropolitan statistical area, our MSA. We've got the city of Dallas, we've got Dallas County, and then we have adjacent counties all around it. This is all an MSA, a metropolitan statistical area, where everything is together. And then I've got our micropolitan statistical area. It's not even really a small m, it's a different feature that I don't have on my computer here, but small m SA. This is a smaller urban area, which includes that urbanized area population, but it's from 10,000 to 50,000 inhabitants, the surrounding county and adjacent counties from there. So this is just smaller in population. Our core-based statistical area, our CBSAs, is going to be a combination of MSAs and the small MSAs. When we take a look at the MSA, or the Metropolitan Statistical Area of St. Louis, we zoom in here. Here's our city. This is our downtown area. The urbanized region are all around it. And then from there, we've got urban clusters. We saw the populations of those numbers, where you've got larger populations dispersed throughout here. But all of this is our MSA. All of this is our Metropolitan Statistical Area. And then way outside of that is where we've got smaller populations in our Micropolitan Statistical Area. Well, when we've got overlapping metropolitan areas, it gets more difficult to define what's what. Consider a megalopolis, or one continuous urban complex. One of the most famous is the Boswash Corridor, or the Boston to Washington, D.C. corridor, which is 440 miles long. From here, what we've got to look at is the city of Boston, Massachusetts. We're on the eastern seaboard of the United States. We've got New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., all along this corridor. And it gets difficult to distinguish MSAs because they all blend in together. At one point, they decided to make Washington and Baltimore all one MSA, a statistical area. But then they decided, well, that's not really fair, so they separated them. The point is, it does become difficult because it's all blended together. Cities, they can annex areas, meaning they can legally add land to an area of a city. And you see historically here, we've got Chicago, and they've done exactly that. In the beginning, this is 1837, here's the city limits. But as the city grew, they annexed areas around them. They basically just said, okay, you know what? Doesn't matter who or what's there. That's now part of the city of Chicago. And in 1870, they annexed this area right here to the west. And from there, you can see how it moved on out. In 1890, they pretty much, I don't even know, quadrupled way more than that of the city of Chicago as they annexed this region here. The thing that's interesting, though, is the density gradient. The population change, it moves outward from the central business district. At the center, of course, we expect this area to be very dense, lots of people living there. As we move out, we expect that there to be less and less people there. But the density gradient in urban areas, there's really a lot fewer differences than you would expect. Like, because it's so dense, there's so much urban happenings and populations that it really doesn't change that much a lot of the times as we move from the city center all the way out, because it remains very densely packed with urban populations. And of course, we discussed the sprawl. the city sprawl, the urban sprawl. This isn't all packed in and then over here this is all farmland and nice greenery. Nope. The city sprawls out in the form of suburbs all across the landscape. So we look at the cost of what that might be, and we're not necessarily talking about financially, we're talking about economically, the cost on the landscape. Well, a lot of land in urban sprawl is used for single family homes. Think about where you live right now in the city of Coppell, Texas. We each probably live in a home or a house where we've got multiple rooms, we've got a yard. Well, that all takes up space. You can see Cleveland here in 1900, their city sprawl there is not very large. And you see that over the years, it starts to sprawl out more and more into the countryside. Along with that, you've got pollution, you've got roadways, you've got tons of concrete, you've got shopping centers, you've got police stations, hospitals, and it all has to take up the landscape. So we think of how much traffic goes into this urban sprawl and how much pollution comes out from cars piling up and sitting in traffic for 45 minutes at a time. All of this agricultural land is lost as well in this city sprawl. Consider in Europe, what they do is green belts, where they force areas between growth. Here's the United States, where we're really kind of packed in here with urban sprawl. Here's the United Kingdom, where they plan and they say, okay, we are not going to allow any city growth here to give this green belt. And the other thing to do is smart growth, where you limit urban sprawl. And that's kind of what they do in the United Kingdom. In Oregon, they did smart growth, where they have the city expanding outward, the sprawl is moving, but they zoned it and restricted growth beyond a certain point. So you would have an area of the land per se, like, okay, at this point, no one can build or grow beyond that. So they wanted to limit the sprawl. So that's good and bad, because the people who had land here were really frustrated because they're like, you know what? We were waiting for the city to get here and we're going to sell our land for a really high price. But now, because of smart growth, the city will not allow us to sell this land because no one can build on it. So we're not going to make any money. But we've got greenery. So you got good and bad sides to that. Segregation in the suburbs. We look at residential segregation, and we really do start to see segregation by social classes, because some people financially, they can afford to buy a certain house, and they're going to want to protect what they've bought. They're protect their investments, so they're going to put up gates. They're going to separate themselves from perhaps lower class people who might turn to a life of crime. They don't want them coming into this neighborhood. So the people who are able to buy and live in this neighborhood, they're going to separate themselves. These lower class minorities, they're not going to be able to access this area. So we start to see residential segregation. And then business-wise, we see the segregation of land uses. We've got commercial and manufacturing. They're no longer in the CBD a lot of the times. They move all the way out to the suburbs because land is cheaper. So the people that live in the CBD downtown, they're not even going to be able to get to their jobs because they cannot afford a car. They can't afford public transportation. They can't afford to live there. So we're seeing even more of this segregation between the middle or upper class people and the lower class workers that cannot afford to move out to the suburbs. Urban transportation. We look at ways of limiting congestion, limiting the amount of cars piled up trying to get in and out of the cities. Because as we have more populations, city sprawl expanding outward, we've got a lot of congestion. We've got a lot of people in personal vehicles that are just taking longer and longer times to get to where they need to get. So cities have looked at ways of controlling vehicles. And what they're doing is they're creating congestion charges, like they're charging people to drive their car. They're creating toll roads. Like you think about the city of Dallas, like almost every highway going in to the city has at least one lane of tolls. You're going to have to apply for permits to drive, and they're tracking patterns with a GPS. So in one sense, perhaps this is good because we're trying to limit the amount of people that are driving their cars into the city. But at the same time, it's also a real concern of mine personally because we're limiting and charging personal freedoms. So it's a balance that we haven't quite worked out yet. And one of the things they've come up with is utilizing systems where people can travel in mass to the city, such as on trains, trolleys, buses, and on the subway. So that they take out that personal vehicle, which typically takes up a lot more space for one person, and find ways of efficiently getting a lot more people into the city. All right, AP Human Geography, welcome to Chapter 13, Key Issue 4. Why do cities face challenges? Cities, they're pretty big. They're going to have challenges. Well, let's talk about changing urban physical geography. How things are growing, how they're dilapidating, as in getting older. The first principle is filtering, where we've got large, older houses that are divided up and rented to multiple families. We've got houses that used to be owned by people that can afford them downtown in the city, and now they're being split up, and 2 or 3, maybe even 4 families are moving into these areas. And maybe that's not a problem, but what happens is you start to add a lot more vehicles that need to park. That's a lot more people that are having to feed into that area, which has been zoned traditionally for maybe a single family home. So there's a lot more usage that goes into that building in that area as well. So it just adds up to the population. These houses and these neighborhoods are overused and they begin to deteriorate. And what was once financially stable, you don't have that economic backing to keep up the older houses. So many of these houses become abandoned due to the higher rents and codes, because as land becomes more valuable and more expensive, the rent also goes up. The house payments also go up, and we're not able to keep up that amount of cost. We're not able to keep up the house. Redlining. What the bank does is, because you've got an area that's so run down within the city, they will redline it, and they'll draw a circle around an area, and they will refuse to loan money to a builder or someone who's wanting to revamp their home, because it's just not going to be worth it. They know they're not going to get their money back. So they can't fix up the area because the banks won't give them money. So redlining is an issue. Public housing. That becomes an issue because what we're doing is we're getting a whole lot of people, a high density of population that are living at low income. The problem is we've got lots of crime, we've got low wages, so we're not making lots of money. We can't put money back into our buildings, and we've got a drug problem. So you consider the story of Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. This is a really cool documentary, and I watched it. You should check it out. It talks about the story of the Pruitt-Igoe series of buildings that they made for low-income housing. At the beginning, you had people very proud to move in there, and they took care of the elevators, and they were clean, and people had a community. But it didn't take long for it to become overrun with population and drugs, and they didn't keep it up. They didn't back it financially. And now it's just a slum of drugs and overpopulation, and it's all run down. This is the problem. You've got to continue to fund these things, and it's not necessarily a good thing to have everybody of the same demographic living in the same building. Gentrification. Here's where we start to see some good changes to urban physical geography, where people move back into the inner city neighborhoods to renovate the housing. They buy up these older houses and they start to bring them back to life. The changing urban social geography. Well, we've got this problem of the underclass, where we have inner city residents that are trapped in an unending cycle of economic and social problems. You've got unemployment, alcoholism, drugs, illiteracy, juvenile delinquency, and crime. This underclass, it all kind of feeds on each other. It's a social, emotional, psychological inability to get out of where you are right now. So it's difficult because people get stuck. You have kids that attend deteriorated schools. So how can you ever imagine that you're going to get out of that? It's difficult to find affordable housing because everything is so expensive downtown. There's a lack of police, hospitals, and fire protection. There's a lack of shops and jobs. If you're trying to better yourself, you can't, because you can't go find a job. You can't go get clothing that's accessible to you and you don't have a car. There's high birth rates because we don't have people educated about birth control. There's a cycle of welfare. If you are existing because you're taking that government check, how are you going to get out of that? Because when you get a job, you lose that government check. And if you have kids, how can you work a job and take care of your kids when you can't afford childcare? And then there's the problem of gangs raising money through drugs. Suburban stress. As rich people move back to the inner city through gentrification, the underclass situation moved out to the inner suburbs. So you have people that are traditionally living downtown. They are forced out by people coming back in through gentrification. They're pushed to the inner suburbs. They're moved to a new location, and we start to see stress then in the suburbs. Consider Chicago, Illinois. We've got Hispanics that move out to the suburbs while whites move back into the north side through gentrification. We can see that process here, where we've got the whites that are moving back into the north side of Chicago in this bluer, greenish area here, and it's pushing the Hispanics out to the suburbs. Because through gentrification, it's good. We're renewing the inner city, but at the same time, we're taking away that lower income housing. And you see all of the Hispanic population moving to the suburbs. In Cincinnati, we've got high stress because school districts are in the suburbs, and now they have low income populations that are moving in. So we've got moderate spending here in the inner city through gentrification, people moving back in. But where's the school districts that are the most stressed? Well, it's in the outer suburbs here, where we've got the high population of low income students. So we've got this interesting process where it doesn't matter where we go. We used to have people in the inner city that were stressed and they have low income, but now they're being pushed out through gentrification. Urban economic geography challenges. Well, we've got an eroding tax base, meaning it's going away. We're not having enough income because in the inner city, we've got low income people, a group of people that cannot afford to pay very much as far as taxes. So how are we going to get money back? These inner city residents require public services, but they pay very little taxes. They need people to take care of them, but they cannot afford to help pay for themselves. So one thing we're having to do, because we don't have a good tax base, is we're having to reduce services. We cannot afford to take care of all those people living in the inner city. The other thing we're having to do is we're having to raise taxes because the people that are living there don't pay very much as far as taxes. So someone is going to have to pay it. We raise taxes. In 2008, we had a recession throughout our entire country. We had the housing market collapse. And so housing prices are higher than they are worth. So if you're trying to buy some housing in the inner city, it's still not that possible, especially to lower income families. And then we do see reviving consumer services in the central business district because they're coming back due to tourism and specialty retail. We've got parks down there. We've coming up with recreational activities to bring people back downtown. So maybe we don't have inner city residents that can pay high taxes, but we create a situation such as Chicago's Navy Pier, where you've got people that do have money that can come back downtown through recreation and tourism, and they spend their money giving us a means to revamp our CBD.